I'm not a social conservative, but I think that this teaching approach, which we label traditional teaching, is more effective and is certainly more effective for those who are, historically have been disproportionately badly affected by ineffective teaching.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of the Rethinking Education podcast. I'm going to try and keep this introduction brief because this is quite a long episode, but it's a really interesting time to be making a podcast called Rethinking Education. It would appear that I'm not the only one with reform on my mind. I don't know if you've noticed, but there has been a plethora of articles in the broadsheets and education press recently about the need to use the opportunity that the COVID pandemic has afforded us to rethink and reform the way in which we educate our children and young people. There are also committees springing up and conferences and organisations like Rethinking Assessment and Square Pegs and School Differently. It really feels like there's a head of steam building at the moment around the need for education reform, and that's amazing and entirely welcome in my view, but it also means the clock is ticking. If we're going to grab this opportunity to hit reset in a really big way, and goodness me, we need to, it's really important that we get this right. Moments like this come around once in a lifetime, and the only way to help shape the conversation is to get involved in any way that you can. One thing that you can do is tell people about this podcast and to join the growing community that surrounds it. It's less than 3 weeks since I announced that we had reached our first 1,000 downloads. We've now already doubled that figure, which is as wonderful as it is welcome. Maybe this is just the normal growth curve for new podcasts, I don't know, but it feels like we might just be at the start of something exponential. So I would like to take this opportunity to welcome any new listeners, to suggest that you go back and listen to some previous episodes, there's some really good ones, and also to signpost you towards the Mighty Network, the Rethinking Education Mighty Network, the online community that is similarly blossoming and growing in numbers. It's a place where listeners to the show can come together to interact with me and my guests and with one another. There are some lovely examples on there of people collaborating and sharing ideas with one another. There's currently around 150 people in this community, which have come together with very little fanfare from me, and it's a lovely thing indeed. Imagine Twitter, but with all the horror stripped out. So do come and join us. You can do so by visiting rethinking-education.mn.co or by downloading the Mighty Networks app and searching for Rethinking Education. Okay, on to today's guest. If you're as interested in productivity as I am, you might want to grab your journal. Adam Boxer is head of science at what he describes as a great secondary comprehensive school in Barnet in North London, and he's a prolific tweeter and blogger. His blog, A Chemical Orthodoxy, recently tipped over 1 million readers, and considering that Adam only recently joined the fold of bloggers, that's really quite impressive. As you will hear, this is the thin end of the wedge of Adam's prolific output, and he is a rare example of someone who's been able to have quite a significant impact on the wider school system while still teaching full-time, which is quite astonishing when you think about it. This, as always, listeners, is a fascinating conversation in which we discuss neotraditionalism, some excellent practical tips on behaviour management and reducing workload, and the thin slither of Twitter beef that Adam and I had, which led to his coming on the show. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Adam Boxer, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Thank you so much. I feel very welcome.
Good stuff. It's really good to get to spend some time with you and to get to know you a little. As you know, this podcast is called Rethinking Education. And by its nature, the very phrase rethinking education is kind of a progressive idea, as in, wanting things to progress, to change, to move forward in some way. And traditionalists tend to be sort of more conservative, right? The whole idea is that you want traditional ideas to remain in place or to even perhaps be even more elevated. And so this podcast has only been going for a month or so, but I think it's fair to say that all the guests that I've had on so far could be characterized as being broadly progressive in their outlook. But you are the first person who's been on the show who I think would be happy to be described as traditionalist. In fact, you've described yourself as lefty trad. You wrote a piece called Lefty Trad. Are you still happy with that label of lefty trad or traditionalist or neo-traditionalist? And if so, can we perhaps begin by exploring what that word or that phrase means to you?
Yes, no, you don't start with the easy ones, do you? Am I still happy with lefty trad? Yes, I do consider myself a lefty, despite, I guess wider politically, I've felt probably quite similar to a lot of people that I felt politically homeless for a while, because despite being left-wing, I'm still a liberal, and I felt that, Jeremy Corbyn's party wasn't for me. However, I still did not, would never vote for anyone even approaching the Conservative Party. So yeah, definitely in terms of what it actually means to be left wing, yeah, like putting my money where my mouth is. Yeah, I consider myself left wing politically, economically, socially. And in that article that you referenced, Lefty Trad, I think the point I was trying to make is that I'm a traditionalist teacher because I'm left-wing. The two things go together. So despite the fact that traditionalism is associated with conservative education policy, and especially what Michael Gove brought in, am I allowed to say his name on this podcast, or do you just bleep it out? Is that how it works?
No, of course, yeah. Mention who you like.
I think the way I tie these things together is that I think for a long time we were doing education in a way that wasn't as effective as it could have been. Everything that we do in education works to some extent, so it's about comparing two things together. I think for a long time we did things in a way that did not improve outcomes, even though it was almost like we thought they were improving outcomes. So things like 5A star to C were skyrocketing from when it was introduced, but standardized international outcomes were stagnating. So our scores on TIMSS, PEARLS, PISA, every single international standardized assessment was just flatlining. But 5A star to C were going through the roof. We had major issues with just curriculum. So, I can speak mainly for the science curriculum. The science curriculum was wafer thin, included this completely bananas controlled assessment that was just like a total joke and didn't actually help anybody. And yes, I think we were dominated beyond curriculum, but in the actual classroom, in terms of pedagogy, styles of teaching, we were dominated by things which were both bad ideas, just that I think now everybody would recognize as bad ideas. So, you won't find many education academics that say to you, that will stand up in public and say, brain gym or neuro-linguistic, whatever it was, or VAC or whatever, are really good ideas. You won't find many of them who'll stand up and say that now. But those ideas did dominate, and certainly teaching strategies that are still promoted by many, whether or not they call themselves progressive, we can talk about labels later on, like this, it's still, I would say very, very common to hear that students learn best by discovery, or inquiry is the best way to teach, or group work is the savior, or if children are misbehaving, it's because you're not engaging enough, or a skills-based curriculum is more appropriate than a knowledge-based curriculum, that kind of thing. And I think those lead to or even even if you take it hasn't been so noisy recently, but last year there were big debates about things like restorative justice in the absence of consequence, and especially the ban the booths, and no more exclusions, those kinds of position to hold, they were the kind of things that used to be just like normal. Like you'd say them and nobody would have a problem with that. Now they're considered like, oh, I'm going to put my head above the parapet with those nasty trads and say something like, I don't think schools should ever exclude anybody. Stuff along those lines. And brought.
Sorry, I was just going to say,
sorry.
should we just briefly, just in case people aren't familiar with ban the booth, so that was in relation to the practice of having isolation rooms, and in particular that some schools have sort of like desk dividers, and some of them have more sort of deep, like what are described as isolation booths, and some people were saying that was somehow, unethical practice or something, just in case people weren't clear what that was.
Sorry, yeah, I should have been clear. I apologize, but yeah, that was the campaign. And essentially, broadly, my personal feelings, as I've developed both in terms of my personal experience in the classroom, as well as my increased reading of the evidence base, is that policies like that tend to disproportionately affect the worse off. So, for example, Wellington College, right, which does a lot of progressive teaching, lots of group work and hippie type stuff, and that's fine. That works for them, and they get great outcomes, and I've got no problem with it. But when it happens in your standard state comp, you end up penalizing the students who essentially come to the classroom with the least. When it comes to things like discovery learning, or any time that the teacher isn't being the center or the source of all knowledge, you are to an extent relying on your students. Your students rely on their own prior knowledge as a crutch to help them through. So the more prior knowledge they have, the easier the lesson will be for them. Now, of course, the students who on average, by the way, I'm always talking on averages, the students who on average come to the class with the least prior knowledge are the ones from the least affluent backgrounds, the ones who might not have had, tons of, rich, diverse, broad, cultural, historical, scientific experiences outside of the classroom, and that leads to them being somewhat disadvantaged once they come into the classroom. So the lefty trad hybrid is me saying, I'm not a social conservative, but I think that this teaching approach, which we label traditional teaching, is more effective and is certainly more effective for those who are, historically have been disproportionately badly affected by ineffective teaching. There's a lot of affected there in a lot of things I said, but hopefully that made sense.
It made perfect sense. Thank you. And I know I didn't ease you in with any small talk, but that was a very fulsome and comprehensive answer to that question. So thank you. I definitely have that inclination at parties. I just go straight in with the big questions. It makes me quite unpopular. So I mean, you're not alone in this, in this lefty trad lane, if you like. There are lots of people who identify with that phrase, and it became a sort of a bit of a hashtag on Twitter. And people like, I know that E.D. Hirsch has described himself as practically a socialist. And it's quite an interesting idea, because people often assume that people of the left politically are more likely to be progressive educationally, perhaps because of like an association with progressive taxation, perhaps, I don't really know. But it does seem to be often the case that people on the left politically are quite traditional in their views on education for precisely the reasons that you just articulated. I mean, it's also been said that people are sometimes, often even conservative about the things that they know best, right? And so, that might be a thing. And so teachers tend to sort of want to stick to what they know. And this might be my assumption, but it's interesting when I was saying earlier about how sort of progressivism is about change and traditionalism is about sort of wanting to preserve things. That might also be a bit of an unfair characterization. It's something that might be interesting to explore. Like you could argue, for example, that in recent years, this rise of what you might refer to as neo-traditionalism could be seen as a reaction against that emphasis on skills that you were just talking about and other things that was proliferated under the new Labour years. And so maybe neo-traditionalism sort of started out as a revolutionary movement in the sense that it was sort of reclaiming the ground, and then it became more conservative once, I think that now that, the Ofsted framework reflects a much more traditional outlook, and so does the assessment regime and so on. And so I suppose, people say that even the most ardent revolutionary becomes a conservative the day after the revolution. So maybe the neo-traditionalists are more conservative now because they're like, okay, we seem to have reclaimed some sort of ground in terms of, making things more about a knowledge-rich curriculum and traditional approaches to behaviour management and so on. Do you think that that's fair to say?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this debate is an old one. this is not a new debate. As far as I'm concerned, I found the earliest example that I could find of this debate in the Babylonian Talmud, right? 6th century, right? I'm not joking. You think I'm joking? So you've got two rabbis.
No, I don't think you're joking. Go on.
You've got two rabbis and they're arguing, right? Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Chisda. And I can't remember which way around it goes, but one of them says to the other, if God forbids. So by the way, so for your listeners' benefit, I'm Jewish, I'm an Orthodox Jew, I take my Judaism very seriously, and these two rabbis are arguing, and the Talmud is all about rabbis arguing with each other, and one of them says, if God forbids the Torah were ever forgotten from the people, so the Torah is the Hebrew Bible, but it's also everything that comes after that, so it's a vast corpus of litigation, of philosophy, of story, everything, the whole works. And he says, where was it? So he says, if God forbids the Torah were ever forgotten from the Jewish people, I would return it with my pilpul. And pilpul is basically oracy. It's like straight up didactics. It's standing up in an arena and giving a lecture to hundreds of people. And then, so that's what he says. And then the other guy, Rabbi Chia or Rabbi Chisda, whichever one it was, he says, I'd go out and I'd hunt some deer and I'd catch some deer and I'd skin them and I'd use their skin as vellum or like a parchment. You turn the skin into parchment. Mm-hmm. And he said he would take 6 deer skins and he would write the books of the Mishnah, which is one of the main law sources. On each one of the skins, he would find 6 children. He would teach one to each child, and then they would each teach the other the remaining bits. So by the end, you'd have 6 children who all knew it because they've been taught 1/6 by the teacher and then 5/6 by their colleagues, and then they would go out and disperse the knowledge amongst the people. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a key example of the difference between an approach which looks, I guess, at the teacher as the font and the source of all knowledge, and the approach that says, no, it's much better to disperse and give little bits to different people and let them then bounce off each other and teach each other. Now, of course, it's not an exact proxy, and there'll be grey-bearded lecturers telling me, well, that's not what I mean when I talk about social constructivism or whatever. But I think it's a good story anyway. I don't know where the word traditionalism or progressive came from in terms of the history. They are the labels that we've got. They're what we'll go for. Yeah, could traditionalism be something else? I prefer explicit teachers. So I prefer, as a philosophy, if people would call us the explicit teachers. But traditionalism seems to be what it is, and it's stuck. So, what do I care?
Yeah, thank you. That is fascinating. I did. I'm just looking it up. The earliest that I previously have found was 1632. So you predated me by about 1,000 years then. But there's a quote by John Amos Comenius, who is often described as the father of modern education. He's a philosopher. He wrote, "Let the beginning and end of our didactics be, seek and find the methods where the teacher teaches less, but they who sit in the desks learn more. Let schools have less rush, less antipathy, and less vain effort, and more well-being, convenience, and permanent gain." So you're right. These arguments and this discussion has a long and distinguished history, and it doesn't seem like it's going to dissipate anytime soon. I should probably sort of say at the outset, I would quite like to come back to this conversation at the end, but the reason that you're on this podcast is because it sort of came out of an exchange that we recently had on Twitter, where I wrote something. I wouldn't call it beef. That would definitely be overstating the case. It's very thin. Is it called a carpaccio or something? We'll call it a carpaccio of beef.
Oh, I love beef carpaccio.
So do I. And this was a tasty bit. So I wrote a tweet. That actually, just listening back, I just published my interview with Guy Claxton yesterday, and I think the reason that I tweeted this, because it's something that I said almost verbatim in the conversation, where I wrote, "Neotraditionalism sells an attractively simple story. Knowledge is foundational and learning is memory. Therefore, we only need to double down on teaching subject knowledge and helping kids remember stuff, and all will be well. If only it were true." Now, obviously, there's a bit of brevity in there because this is Twitter and you have to sort of, be succinct. And there's a lot more to it than I expressed there. But you took exception to this. You responded that you thought that you said that's not true at all. It's a big straw man. And kindly you said, I think you're better than that. So obviously you hold me in at least some esteem, or at least you did. And we went on to have a further exchange, which I'm keen to explore in more detail. But I think that we should do that at the end of this conversation, if that's okay. Cool. I think that part of the problem that we see so often on Twitter is that people are sort of banging their heads together without ever really taking the time to understand their interlocutor. Like, who is this person that I'm disagreeing with, and why do they think what they think? And that's sort of like the whole idea of this show, right? Is that, on some podcasts, people often begin by saying, just tell me, like a 1 minute summary of your life to date sort of thing. And people go, oh, okay, like went to school, became a teacher, blah, 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 had a big thing, and now here I am. And I always think that's the most interesting bit of the story. Like, let's blow that up. And so probably the first sort of half-ish of each show has been talking about the person and the journey that they have been on, to get to the point where you are. And then we'll think about the rethinking education stuff. And then we'll come back to this carpaccio of beef at the end, if we may.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, good stuff. So as someone who has an interest in productivity, perhaps an unhealthy interest in productivity, I have to say that I am just hugely impressed with how prolific and productive you seem to be. Here's a brief summary of the things that I'm aware of that you do or have done recently with your time. Let's see if I captured all the main things. So you teach full-time, you're a head of department, aren't you? A head of science.
Yep.
And a chemistry, is your degree in chemistry?
My degree is in chemistry, yeah.
Yeah, so chemistry teacher. She's a recurring theme of the podcast, weirdly. I was also a chemistry teacher, and two previous guests, Ian Cunningham and Guy Claxton, both also did degrees in chemistry. Make of that what you will.
You've got good taste.
I adore it as a subject. It really makes sense in a way that physics just never did to me. Like, it just fits together like Lego, and it's really logical, and it gives you such an insight into how the world works. So big fan of chemistry.
Well, it's great fun, and I'm hiring, by the way. So if you ever feel like stepping back into the classroom, then you just let me know. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Let's see if you still the offer still holds by the end of this conversation. So you're also a parent of two young children, which is no mean ticket. So straight away, head of department, two young kids. Like, for most people, that's like, okay, that's plenty to be getting on with. But you do all this other stuff as well. So you write a blog, which I saw recently just ticked over 1 million hits or 1 million visitors, which is a lot. So that's a Chemical Orthodoxy. You've written revision guides. You edited the research ed book on explicit and direct instruction. You wrote a whole lot of lessons for Oak National, the thing that was set up to support schools and parents during the pandemic. Did you write was it over 40?
I did 44, yeah. So it's 4 a week for 11 weeks.
That's a huge amount, and it's really time consuming, isn't it? Recording stuff and editing it is a very time consuming process.
I tell you, James, it was the worst period of my life. It was absolutely dreadful because it wasn't really 11 weeks. It was more like 9, because I had to get all mine done before paternity leave, because my wife was heavily pregnant, and I was looking after my 3-year-old daughter every day. So essentially I was looking after Sophia.
That's right. This is when the nurseries were closed.
Yeah, nurseries were closed. So I was looking after her Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then basically doing my job, which was being the head of department of a school working remotely, and doing these lessons for Oak, essentially like in the evenings, on the weekends. And it took hours and hours to do these recorded videos. There were multiple levels of quality assurance, and I was lucky, I was supported, and everyone was really collaborative and helpful and stuff. But it was absolute hell. I was working the hours that a normal person would be working in a week, but I was doing it in the evenings and on weekends.
Yeah,
it was grim.
Yes, I remember seeing some. It was an incredible effort, and so many teachers stepped up and contributed to that project, and it was absolutely phenomenal the way that unfolded. So you're the co-founder of a thing called Carousel Learning, which is sort of came out of Retrieval Roulette, wasn't it?
That's correct.
Can you just explain to people briefly what Retrieval Roulette and Carousel are?
Yeah, so Retrieval Roulette was So evidence tells us that an effective study technique is retrieval practice, which is the act of being quizzed as opposed to rereading or highlighting or summarizing content. And yeah, it's an interesting one because it puts lie to the old adage, which is you don't make a pig fatter by weighing it. In reality, doing low stakes tests do help our memories. They help our retention. They slow the inevitable process of forgetting.
Yeah.
So the Retrieval Roulette was really just this very simple Excel program where you write in a whole load of questions and answers. So a question might be, I don't know, define an element or define a molecule, or what is a compound. It might be slightly more complex than that. So explain why sodium is more reactive than lithium or whatever. And then the Excel spreadsheet, you just told it how many questions you wanted, and it spat them out in random order and put them on the board for you. So you'd start up your lesson, you'd open the Retrieval Roulette, you'd say, I'm up to question 183, that's ionic bonding. I'd like 5 questions, please. And it would just put 5 questions randomly selected from that on the board. And it was a great program, and it became an amazing collaborative success. I had dozens of teachers contributing their own versions. I can contribute chemistry, but not much else. So we had history ones, English ones, music, languages, loads of stuff. But it's an Excel program, so it could only go so far, and it wasn't exactly like an attractive piece of kit, and certainly it wasn't useful for students at home, because whenever I sent it home to students, they had problems with Excel, problems downloading, problems there, problems didn't know how to work it, blah blah blah, etc. etc. Anyway, long story short, I'm now in business with a fellow called Josh Perry and Jose Diaz, who's from Air Curie, which is an amazing educational technology software development organization, corporation, company, business, something like that. And we built this thing called Carousel Learning, which it's basically a pimped up version of the Retrieval Roulette. So you upload your question banks from Excel, so just questions and answers, and then you use it to set quizzes for your students, which they then do on their end. And it takes literally 3 minutes to get started at the beginning, and it takes about 30 seconds to set a quiz. The kids do it. They can revise using flashcards beforehand. They then do a quiz. They self-assess, which is really nice. You can moderate their self-assessment. You can see all of their responses. You get data analytics and everything they've done. You can take question banks from the community. So if you're a history teacher and you don't happen to have any massive Excel question banks, you just load up the community and you say, oh, Mr. Whoever has made a really nice question bank. You import that. It's dead simple. We're building in amazing features like we're going to develop the automatic marking. So it does automatically mark some of the students' answers, but we're going to get it basically over time. It's going to get smarter and smarter. We're going to do things like whole class feedback. We're going to do in-class use, so like projecting onto the board like the Retrieval Roulette used to do. All sorts of amazing things. And yes, hopefully that will go from strength to strength.
It's very cool. And it's free, is it?
It's currently free, yeah. Obviously, nothing is free. And we were very lucky that we got government grants to set up. Obviously, in time, we are going to have to start charging people as part of a revenue model. But there will always be a free product. There'll just also be a premium thing. I said when Josh first called me and to talk about business and stuff, I said that I knew we'd never be able to keep it free because people don't work for free. That's not a thing. But the philosophy which underpins the Retrieval Roulette of helping teachers out had to carry through. And the others are completely on board with that. So we're trying really hard. We're putting together our plans for the premium model now, and we're trying really, really hard to get everything right in terms of both where we pitch the price and also how we go about pitching it. Because like the last thing I want is for a teacher who uses this is a really, really sad state of affairs in our system where teachers pay for stuff for their class out of their own pocket.
Yeah.
So, for example, people might pay for a resource on tests. They might buy glue sticks. They might buy scissors. Whatever it is, they'll buy for their own classes out of their own pocket. And I will be horrified if teachers end up paying for it out of their own pocket. Obviously, I can't stop people doing that, but we need to make the conditions such that rarely, if ever, happens, which is why we'll be trying really hard to plug school accounts and department accounts and things like that instead. So yeah, it's difficult and it's complicated, and And to be honest, it's the only thing in the whole project that's made me feel a bit anxious, because I like to, I try as hard as I can to give as much as I can for free. I publish tons of resources that are free, but those revision books that you spoke about just before, people have got to pay for those. It can't, and not everything can come for free. And I just think it's really important that we're careful not to go too far.
Yes, I agree. I've been on a similar journey myself. I don't like the idea of taking money out of essentially the public purse and out of the school's budget for things that should be freely available. But also, sometimes there are things that, like you say, it only works. It's not possible to do it, always with a government grant, and it costs a lot of money to develop stuff and to invest in it and to host it on a website and to make sure that it works. And these things cost money, and schools have budgets. And if it saves them time, and this saves, schools with a lot of time with marking and homework, for example, then people are going to value that. And so I don't see a problem with it. But I sort of sense your unease, and I share that feeling as well. So we're still listing all of the things that you do here. So on top of this, you're also the founder and managing editor of Cog Sci Sci, which is sort of like the.
I'm not the managing editor anymore.
Oh, really?
I stepped back a couple of months ago because I didn't have time to give to it.
That's right. I saw that somebody else has taken that on, haven't they?
Adam Robbins, he's doing a fine job.
Can you explain briefly to listeners what Cog Sci Sci is?
Yeah, so Cog Sci Sci is a grassroots collective of science teachers who are interested in injecting their teaching with evidence from the cognitive sciences. So things like cognitive load theory, retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, desirable difficulties, all of that stuff. So it's really a subject-specific community where we are trying to apply that evidence, not in a general way, but in kind of just really specific to the science classroom. We started as just a few teachers bantering around on Twitter, and this is 3.5 years ago now, I think. And we did a conference. I say a conference. There were, I think, 16 or 17 of us that year, and then it grew slowly. We did an email group, and people signed up. And then we had another conference that summer where there were about 40 of us, which was nice. And then the next summer we did one where there were over 80 of us and a very long waiting list. And then there were a bunch of regional events that were due to take place that had to be cancelled because of COVID. But we now have a website. That's why I set up the website, not this past summer, but the summer before. And on the website, we've got blogs, we've got reading lists, we've got resources, we've got curated resources. So it's not just anything goes. It's we've had a look and said, yeah, this is good. We've got free CPD modules, which, if I can say so myself, are very high quality. We've got a whole bunch of other stuff. And we're now, there's a couple of thousand teachers on the email group. We have a lot of engagement. A lot of people are interested. And yeah, it's a growing community, and it's the kind of thing that I wish I could dedicate more time to, but don't have it.
Indeed. Well, you seem to be squeezing a lot out of the time that you do have. You've also made lots of very helpful videos on chemistry. I saw is it Boxer's Shorts?
Yes,
the hilariously titled Boxer's Shorts. I really wish that had been around when I was teaching chemistry. And on behaviour, I don't know how many you've done on behaviour, but I know that there's one video that you've done that's been very widely viewed. And again, I would really have liked for that to have been around when I was in the classroom. And it seems to me that lots of the stuff that you write about, I mean, it's obviously really helpful to lots and lots of teachers, right? Like that's why so many people visit your blogs and watch the videos and so on and find it really helpful. And it seems to me that it's helpful because it focuses on like really hyper specific things about like sort of if X happens, then Y happens. And there's just one example that I'd quite like to look at, if you don't mind, which was a blog that you wrote recently called Front Loading. And it's such a classic thing. So it starts. I'll read the first bit out, if I may. It says, so here's the scene. It's 3:02 p.m. and 8 SC2 have been working well throughout the double lesson. The bell goes in 3 minutes. Teacher goes, "Okay, year 8, well done today. In a minute, we're going to pack up and stand behind our chairs, but I want you to make sure you've written down the homework from the board. Dave and Charlie, please stay at the end, and can you all remember to put your papers in the bin?" Close quote. And then you start by saying, as a set of instruction, this looks pretty clean. The teacher uses praise. There's an economy of language. They don't get too bogged down in details. And yet, as every teacher will know, it doesn't work. As soon as the teacher is a few words in, the noise starts to build. The students start packing away their books and pencil cases, putting on their cates. The chairs start shuffling. Every teacher will be familiar with this scene. And it's a really classic example of something. So do you want to briefly explain what front loading is and how that might help in that situation?
Yes, so front loading is essentially something that I've come to realize, and this is both in pedagogy and in behavior management, is that the first thing that happens is the thing that people focus on. So in a question, so there's a classic example, GCSE question, which is, deduce the ionic formula for neutralization reactions, include state symbols in your answer. And I taught this student who, he was a very high performing student. He ended up with, I think, 10-9 grades, and a string of A stars off to Cambridge and the like. And he used to, him and his parents kept telling me that I wasn't pushing him hard enough in lessons. Actually, he didn't say that. His parents said that. And I would always say to him, we'll call him Dave. I said, Dave, do you think I'm not pushing you hard enough in lessons? He'd be like, no, it's fine. It's fine. And his mum would be like, no, we don't think he's being pushed hard enough. That's okay, fine. And so the first parents' evening I had with them, I said to them, well, look, I mean, we've done 4 tests so far, and he's not scored 100% in any of them. So as far as I'm concerned, there's still stuff he's getting wrong. He's being pushed plenty. So he was always desperate to get full marks. And in this exam, where it said, derive the ionic equation for the neutralization reaction, include state symbols in your answer, 2 marks, he got 1 mark. And the 1 mark he got was for deriving the neutralization reaction, but the mark he didn't get was for the state symbols. He just didn't put them in. Now, he knows what the state symbols are. It's trivial for him, but he didn't put them in. Why? Because there's 2 parts to the question. As soon as you read the first part, your brain starts whirring and clanking and gearing away, and there's only so much room in there, and it just doesn't take in the stuff after. And then people are like, oh, he didn't read the question. Of course he read the question. No one stops reading halfway through. It's such a banal piece of advice. It doesn't make any sense. You didn't read the question. Of course I read the question. It's just that by the time you got to the end of the question, your brain was only focusing on the first part of the question. So it's true in academics, it's true in behavior management as well, that if I say to students, okay, the bell's going to go soon, I'm already cueing them to be thinking about the bell and packing up. Or if I say in a minute we're going to pack up, they're going to start packing up. So what you do instead is you front load what Doug Lemov calls the means of participation, the way you want your students to participate. So in that particular example, you'd say something like, nobody is going to pack up. Eyes up here, all eyes on me, thank you. And you wait. This isn't a pause that you should edit out, by the way. I'm pausing deliberately. And you wait and you look around and you say, well done. Thank you, Dave, for paying attention. Lovely. And then you reiterate and you say, nobody is going to pack up. First, I would like everybody to write down the homework in their planner. And then you wait. And then you say, next, Dave and Kevy, please, I'd like you to stay at the end. Thank you. Now I'd like you to pack up. So you've kind of flipped the instructions. You do it much more slowly. So the point of that blog is to include other strategies as well. So what I did then is I did front loading, I did means of participation, and I did you can't see me across the video, but in class I'd be doing things like I'd be seen looking, I'd be narrating the positive. So I'm kind of emphasizing a positive culture in my classroom. But more simply, when in the class, whenever you're asking a question and you want to say things like let's say you don't want a kid to call out, right? So don't ask the question and then say, don't call out, please, right? Say, without calling out, can somebody tell me the formula for hydrogen, right? So by putting that at the beginning of the question, you preempt half of the calling out. It just doesn't happen. Whereas if you say, okay, can someone tell me can someone tell me the formula for hydrogen? Oh, without calling out, then you increase the chances of the calling out happening. And this is kind of across the board that, you always want to put in your means of participation, which is how you want the students to participate. If it's their mini whiteboards, if it's by putting their hands up, or sometimes you might want them to call out. If you're doing, you're doing choral response, right? And you're saying, what is the formula for hydrogen, right? So there's one answer, it's H2. And you want every student to say it. What is the formula for hydrogen? Don't say, what is the formula for hydrogen? We're going to do this by choral response. Say, okay, this one's going to be by choral response. So you're all going to respond to me at once together on 3. Okay, so all going to respond to me on 3. What is the formula for hydrogen? All going to respond to me on 3. What is the formula for hydrogen? 1, 2, 3. Boom. And then you've put all of the means of participation, you've made it so clear, you've put it at the beginning, it's front and foremost in their minds, people aren't going to get that stuff wrong. And there's a bunch of examples then in the blog, but again, the key would be that it's about realizing that the stuff that comes first is what's going to come first in their heads and often in their mouths, and to combine that then with other techniques and strategies to build like a sequence of instructions that's super clean, super clear, super sharp, and minimizes the chances by which someone will get it wrong.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned that other thing. There was two recent blogs that you wrote. One of them was the front loading one, and the other one was called Sir, I Know This. And that's what the thing that you sort of touched on there, which was again something that I used to struggle with endlessly, which is like you set out your thing and you're like nobody calls out, but then it's something that Doug Lemov refers to as sins of enthusiasm. Is that right? Yeah. So it's like, and that's it, because it's like there's a kid at the front and they call out the right answer, and you go, oh, I'm just going to let it slide because you're obviously, this was well intentioned. I'm not going to punish that, right? How can I punish that? You're just like enthusiastic about chemistry, right? But that's like just the beginning of a slippery slope, isn't it? That you're like, if you let that slide, then all of a sudden, you can't sort of stem the flow that's going to inevitably follow. And so lots of this very hyper-specific stuff is really useful. And there's that video that you where you outline this, and it's very, very helpful. Again, like I wish that I'd seen it a number of years ago, and so I'll put links to all of this stuff in the show notes. So thank you for all of the things that you do on behalf of the teaching profession. It's amazing, and it's a very impressive thing that you're able to have such a wide influence and impact across the profession while teaching full time. Like, I don't know many other people who've managed to do that, so it's very impressive. Well done.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Look, I mean, I'm happy to help, and honestly, I'm honored every time someone reads it. And if people find my stuff helpful, then I'll keep producing it. Then the second people stop reading my blog, then okay, maybe it's time to stop blogging and do something else. Yeah,
well, who knows? Who knows what the future holds? Okay, so exactly. Let's get to the finding out about you bit. So I'd like to hear about your own experience of education. What kind of school were you at? What were you like at school? What was your experience of education more broadly?
Okay, so as I mentioned a bit earlier, I'm Jewish, and that has quite an important part to play in this story. So we are Orthodox Jews, which is one denomination of Judaism. There's a few different denominations. There aren't that many of us. There aren't that many Jews full stop in the UK. And then obviously an even smaller count of that are Orthodox, and then an even smaller count of that are Orthodox and religious, right? So in the same way that a lot of people refer to themselves as Catholic and never go to church or do anything, that kind of thing. So we are religious, we are Orthodox, and I went to a Jewish primary school. So I grew up in Stanmore, which is in London, northwest London, top of the Jubilee line. And I went to a local school, primary school. I was a nice, quiet, sweet kid who tried to do the right thing. I was very unremarkable the whole way through primary school. Then in secondary school, I turned into a bit of a terror, and I was absolutely dreadfully behaved. I mean, the why is pretty obvious. Like, I just wanted people to laugh, and I wanted to have friends, and I thought the way to do that was by mucking about. And I went to a school, it was also a Jewish school, and I went to a school where at that time, things have changed since then, but at that time there was it's a bit difficult to explain because it's hard to know how far to go back. So within Orthodox Judaism, there are also further denominations in the same way that there are within, I guess, Catholicism or any other religious denomination. And the school that I went to was ultra-Orthodox, or what's called Haredi, and the philosophy of the ultra-Orthodox philosophy started a couple of hundred years ago in opposition to modernity. So in opposition to the liberalism and emancipations and Renaissance and scientific revolution that was taking place from the 16th, 17th, 18th century onwards. So ultra-Orthodoxy kind of set up in opposition to that, and as a firm rejection of modernity. So modernity carried many philosophical challenges, things like the advent of science, evolution, etc., etc. Individual autonomy was a big one, of course, questioning the authenticity of the Hebrew Bible and its origins, that kind of stuff. So it was very much, ultra-Orthodoxy was a reaction against this. And ultra-Orthodoxy is still very common, and there's tens of thousands, probably close to 1 million adherents around the world, lots in Israel, lots in the States, lots here as well. And the school that I went to was ultra-Orthodox. So even though they offered a secular education, as was their legal duty and obligation, the point of the secular education culturally was always to enable a person to get a job. Right? It was there. You got a secular education, so you could get a job, so you could earn a living, and so that either you could, so you could donate lots of money to charity and support other people to sit and learn all day. The ideal of the ultra-Orthodox is to not have a job and to not work, but to sit and learn Torah all day, to just study the Bible and the codes and the Talmud, like we spoke about earlier. Somebody has to pay for that, so that's what the ultra-Orthodox who don't want to do that do. So you either go off and you just learn all day, or you go into business, you make lots of money, and you support the people who want to learn all day. So the principle is that the education that is on offer, the secular education that is on offer, is very much like ancillary, it's secondary, it's very utilitarian. And it meant that the culture of the school was kind of dodgy, and there was poor behavior was quite common, and not showing respect to teachers or to the dignity of the subject, I think was quite common as well. And I sadly, to my shame, was a part of that. My family were not ultra-Orthodox, and I was never ultra-Orthodox. I was what's called modern Orthodox, which is about synthesizing, as opposed to rejecting modernity. It's about synthesizing modernity with orthodoxy and with traditional belief and behavior. But I didn't really know what it was all about. So because I was in an ultra-Orthodox school, it's like, I don't know, what's it like? It's like being a Northern Labour hardcore red to the bone and being sent to Eton. It's that kind of thing where you're like, you're different, but you're not 100% sure why, or what it is that you believe that is different, or even if those beliefs are like legitimate or where they fit in or what their history is at all. But when I finished school with a view to do medicine. My grandfather was a doctor. My father was a doctor. Young Adam too, he shall be a doctor. So I had a couple of places to study medicine when I finished school. I had A-levels in biology, chemistry, and maths. And then I went to Israel to study. So it's quite common in my community to go to Israel for your gap year. And I chose to go to study to what's called a yeshiva, which is it's basically an academy. It's a site of religious learning. And the one that I went to is considered the elite one of the modern Orthodox community. So it's like the jewel in the modern Orthodox crown. Most of the kids there are Israeli. There are about 550 students there. And there's 5 different year groups. So it's complicated, but basically the Israelis do a 5-year program which incorporates army service. So in Israel, there's conscription into the Israeli army, but a lot of students choose to go study in a yeshiva, and they do a 5-year course that involves a 1.5 to 2 years in the army and the rest of the time studying. So they're there in 5-year groups, and then the abroad students are normally either go for 1 year or 2 years, sometimes longer, but mostly 1 year or 2 years. And I met a lot of Americans who are academically very high performing, and I met a lot of Israelis academically very high performing as well. But most importantly, I was exposed through them and through the culture and ethos of the academy that I visited, that I was studying at, to the idea that learning and secular education isn't just a means to an end or something that helps you get a job, but is kind of worthy and valuable and dignified in and of itself. And that was really the first time that I've been exposed to that. And as someone who'd been quite kind of disparaging of my formal education, and and especially of things like the humanities and the arts, that was quite a wake-up call for me. The example that I quote of just how useless I was is that I went to my English literature exam, my GCSE in English literature. I went thinking Duffy and Armitage was the name of the publisher of the anthology, right? So I kid you not, yes, I still got an A. But that probably says more about the GCSE than it does about me. But I had no respect for it. I didn't think it was worthwhile in the slightest. And then all of a sudden I'm exposed to people who don't think like that. And the head of this yeshiva, a man called Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who is to this day, sadly he died, 7 or 8 years ago now, maybe 6 years ago. But he's the smartest man I've ever been in a room with, and also the most humble. And he used to be a professor of English literature in the States. And his field was he did a lot of poetry, a lot of Frost, but his real academic field was Cambridge Neoplatonism, whatever that is, and Milton. And he once said, and he had this low American voice, it was very hard to follow what he was saying, and he said that he once read Milton, Paradise Lost, and it was the first time that I fully understood it. And it was the 27th time that I'd read it. And I was like, this is the kind of guy that we're dealing with. But like, he took that stuff seriously. And for me, that was like a big, big awakening, because all of a sudden I was being exposed to like an intrinsic value and worth somewhere that I had not really considered worthy. Anyway, so I also decided at that time that I didn't want to do medicine. I don't think I'd ever wanted to do medicine. It would just been like assumed. And again, at the school that I was at, being a doctor was like a worthwhile career to do. It was one of the only careers outside of business that was considered okay. So I spoke to my parents and we came to an agreement, and I decided to stay in this place for 2 years instead of 1 year. And I applied for university. My parents said, look, you can stay on condition that you have somewhere to come back to. They wanted me to go to university. That was really important to them, and quite right. They needed to know that I was coming back and had something to come back to. So I had A-levels in chemistry, biology, and maths. It doesn't really leave you with that many options. I liked chemistry the most. I knew I was a good mathematician, but I was never a mathematician. So my biology was the weakest of the three. So I applied for a degree in chemistry, and I was very lucky that they gave me the choice, that they actually let me in. To this day, I'll be grateful to Dr. Dewey Lewis, who was the admissions tutor at UCL, who did me the courtesy of calling me to tell me why he wasn't going to give me a place. So he called my parents. He was like, I've got this application. Like I had the smarts. I had my A-levels were good, but I was taking a year out, and I wanted to actually take 2 years out. I was applying in my gap year for a deferred entry place, and he called we spoke on the phone. He basically said that out of his students who take a gap year, 50% don't make it the whole way through the course, and I wanted to take 2 gap years. And I didn't really have much to say to that. I was like, look, I appreciate you calling me. I don't really have anything to say back to that. I guess all I could say to you is that, like, I'm not wasting my time. I'm not bumming around Thailand smoking weed on the beach. Like, I'm sitting in a chair studying for 15 or 16 hours a day straight. Like, I'm not
Really?
messing around here.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's intense.
and I can bring that, and I will be bringing that back. And he hummed and he hawed, and he eventually gave me a place, which I was really grateful to him for. I made it back here, went to UCL, and about 6 months into the course, I was like, this is not for me. I had originally signed up for a master's, which is 4 years, and I was like, mate, I'm barely going to manage 3. I really enjoyed the big picture stuff. So like learning about quantum mechanics, like that is just incredible. Like the first time you learn about quantum mechanics, it blows your mind. But then when you actually start getting into the nitty gritty of how to solve the Schrödinger equation, I'm like, well, I don't really think this is actually for me. And I was doing a lot of youth work at the time. I was doing a lot of community education and adult education in my local community. And I decided I wanted to apply to be a teacher. And when I was like really nervous to break it to my parents. Like my dad has basically only just recently come around to the idea that teaching is a proper career, but I'm not sure he's still convinced. But my mum said to me, she said, I always knew you were going to be a teacher. I was just waiting for you to realize it. So I was like, okay, fine. I can do this. I applied for Teach First and got horribly rejected, which is probably one of the great things that happened to me, because I would have hated it. And I then got rejected by the Institute of Education. And at that point, I was borderline giving up. I had one more place on my list, which is I'd applied for Hertfordshire, UH. And I said, you know what, if they don't give me a place, I'll just do something else. I had a degree in chemistry, and I was en route to getting a very good quality of degree. Like I had options. And then UH interviewed me, they gave me a place, and I was like, okay, fine, let's go for this. And I was under the tutelage of the great Lynn Chapman, who is a legend in Hertfordshire science. And I had a really great time. I absolutely loved my PGC. I loved the assignments. I loved the work. I loved being in schools. I just, it was a great year. It was hard. It was tough for sure. I think everyone finds it tough. I'd be amazed if there's anyone who doesn't find their PGCE tough, but I enjoyed it and I learned a lot. I then I went to my first school, which is JFS, which is a big Orthodox Jewish school in Kenton. Sorry, excuse me. Historically, very, very high standards, very high results. It's a state comp, but because it's, the faith schools are all kind of partially selective in the sense that they select from their community, which has its, eccentricities, and the Jewish community happens to have the eccentricity of being academic, and the Jewish schools do have high results. For whatever reason, I've got no idea, but it just, it is the way it is. And I was there for a couple of years, and I was very much, I considered myself a social constructivist. I believed devoutly in discovery learning and inquiry learning. I believed strongly that I should not talk for too much in a lesson. I believed strongly in the power and greatness of group work, of transferable skills, of the need to get kids up and out of their seat and active learning. What are the other things that I used to believe? I thought that if students misbehaved, it's because I wasn't engaging them enough, and I had to change the type of activity that I was doing, that kind of thing. And that was all in my first school.
And do you say that you believe devoutly in these approaches, these very sort of progressive sounding approaches of discovery, that like knowledge that is discovered is somehow better or retained better than knowledge that is taught? Is that stuff that you were taught explicitly, or is this something that you picked up along the way? How do you think that you came to hold these beliefs?
So it's a good question, because I wasn't reflective about it at the time. Right? It's just the water that you swim in. It's the air that you breathe, right? So I wasn't reflective about it at the time, and it was never presented as some people believe this, other people believe that, and we think that that is right. It was just like something that underlay the whole thing. It was just assumed. So I don't know if I was ever explicitly told, if you tell students things, they'll forget it quicker. It was just assumed. And you'd get much more positive feedback, for example, on lesson observations. They'd say, oh, it was really good the way you let them figure that out for themselves. And actually, to be fair, we did have so we use like the 5E model, which is explore, engage, explore, explain, extend, evaluate, maybe. But like the whole first phase of teaching anything was about the students just like mucking about with it with their hands and just that kind of stuff, and like using some kind of like sticky kitschy hook to like draw them in. So it was just assumed. I definitely believed it. I didn't get it from nowhere, and it was without a doubt the orthodoxy. I was not distinct or different from anybody in doing it. I might have been a bit more committed to carrying it out, but everybody around me was, nobody said, maybe actually just flipping tell them, just have them working by themselves in silent. Like that was never given to me as feedback. So it was just very much like what was done.
And what year did you qualify?
So I started training in September 2013. So I finished then in June, July 2014. And then my first job was September 2014. And it was about 18 months into that job at JFS, I started reading stuff. And I particularly enjoyed, I read the tests every week. Right. So my father-in-law is in education as well. He used to get a copy, and I used to get his copy when they're done with it. So for as long as I've been training, I read the test cover to cover every single week. And again, it was just the stuff that was normal in there. There was no one in there saying, this is what explicit instruction is. This is why it's got more evidence. There was no one in there saying discovery is actually maybe not the best way for students to learn things. So, again, it was just the air that you breathed. But I read it every week, cover to cover. And I particularly enjoyed, there was this guy called Tom Bennett who wrote a column on behaviour each week that I quite enjoyed. And at one point he wrote an article where he said that teachers should get on Twitter. And I was like, all right, let's give this a go. And I was a social media addict already at that point. So I was Facebooking all over the place, getting in arguments with people and the like. And I got on this thing called Twitter, and then through there I started reading blogs, and especially by Greg Ashman, David Didow, Daisy Christodoulou, because she was still blogging a lot of the time. Joe Facer was blogging a lot of the time. Carl Hendrick was blogging a lot of the time. A lot of the people who don't blog at all anymore. And slowly, as well as reading some key pieces of literature like Rob Coe's What Makes Great Teaching, which I think you and I have spoken about before. And slowly, I started doing very much I don't know how it's pronounced, volte-face. I don't know how it's pronounced, about face.
Yeah.
Is that how it's pronounced?
I've got no idea. I would say volte-face, but I've got, that's a guess.
No, not a clue. Anyway, that's what I did. And I flipped 180. Such to the extent that I think in my NQT year, like my performance management target was about doing more group work. And then by the time I got to my second school, which is in my third year of teaching, I was like, absolutely not a chance my students ever working in a group. It's just not on the cards. So very much changed a lot then. And I left that first school because there were some things that weren't going so well. Not for me personally, just the school was in a really tough time, and I moved to a different school called JCOS, which is another Jewish school, but it's cross-denominational. So it's not an Orthodox school, it's a pluralist school. It's very hippie in terms of its philosophy. And I was there for 3 years, and I joined just as a rank and file straight up teacher, and then I picked up a couple of TLRs along the way. I did work with the Oxbridge kids, which was brilliant. I was a lead teacher, and I was the kind of semi-second in department in science. It was complicated, but that was kind of the role. And then in my third year there, I was so comfortable. It was like everything was just going great. Like I didn't have any problems with behavior management. Nobody bothered me. No one kicked up a fuss. Like I'd had some problems with some observations previously. And so like I had this observation where it was part of we did like an internal Ofsted type thing. The school was all about that kind of stuff, sadly. And I was observed by someone from outside the department who, to be honest, I don't think should be observing me in a high stakes observation anyway. And she gave like this mad feedback. They were still grading lessons at that point, which was bananas to start with. And I had this mad feedback where she said things like, she was full of praise the whole lesson. She said, the kids were answering questions, so many, it was really great. And she said, I then looked in the books and I saw there wasn't much marking. And I was like, yes, the science department has an annex to the teaching and learning policy that says we don't do a lot of book marking. And she says, yes, that's fine. But what that means is that I couldn't see evidence of like where you'd like really been like hearing them, listening to them and getting a feel for what they know. And I was like, well, hang on a second. You just said to me 5 minutes ago as part of this feedback that I asked a lot of questions and they were all targeted. Right, I asked 60 to 70 questions in that 55-minute lesson. They're all targeted. They're sprayed around the room. I get plenty of data, and I spread out over time. And she was basically like, "But yeah, you didn't have any of the like whole class AFL techniques, like red, yellow, green cards or thumbs up, thumbs down." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't, because that's not the way I do AFL. Like I taught this class for 6 months. I know what they know and I know what they don't know." And she said, "Yes, but still," and gave me a 3. And I was like. I wasn't particularly happy because like I hadn't had a 3 since like the start of my PGCE, and I was like, grades are stupid, and this is part of the reason why they're stupid is because they make people who are quite confident and comfortable in their teaching feel like crap.
Yeah.
And I was furious. I was livid, and I told my head of department that the head teacher would have my resignation tomorrow. Right, I was just so angry. I was furious. Wow. And like there was a whole load of stuff that built up to this as well. Like a whole load of I felt like I was very protective of the department. I felt like a whole lot of my colleagues had been mistreated in a similar way. Like one of my colleagues had been told that the level of challenge of the questions wasn't appropriate that he was using. And the teacher who had observed him, who was an English teacher, was observing an A-level biology lesson where they were just doing exam questions in preparation for their A-level exam. And he's like, who do you think you are? Like telling me that A-level biology exam questions aren't appropriate for an A-level biology class. And so like I was furious about that. I was livid about the whole thing. And one of the teachers who was supposed to observe me also hadn't turned up and stuff. It was just the whole thing was completely mad. And anyway, me and the heads, we had quite a punchy relationship anyway. He is a brilliant man. He is a Church of England. He's a priest. Who is the head of a Jewish school. He's a remarkable fellow. And we had a fairly punchy conversation about it. He managed to convince me not to do something as ridiculous as resign, which obviously would have been daft and hubristic and full of ego and the like. And he pointed all this out to me, which was the right thing to do. But, I was having problems there. I wasn't happy. And I think for me, the most important thing was that I knew I was getting better as a teacher, but not as a result of anything anyone around me had said to me. I was getting better because in a vacuum. I was getting better because of the stuff that I was reading and the stuff that I was trying out for myself. And it was slow and it was painful. And there was nobody around who could, I couldn't say to someone like come in and tell me, whether you think the explanation was clear enough and whether or not I've deployed the multimedia effect appropriately. Like, it just didn't happen. I didn't have someone coming into my lessons and giving me like lightning, precise feedback that moved me on. And I felt that even though I was comfortable and I was doing well and I wasn't having any problems, I wasn't being pushed and I wasn't getting better fast enough. So I had a look around at some schools and some various positions, and I applied to a few places. And fortunately, the only place that didn't reject me was the Totteridge Academy, which is a United Learning school. It's in Barnet, so I drove past it on my way to JCOS every morning for 3 years. And it's the best decision I've ever made in my life. Other than, marrying wife, having children, that's the best professional decision. Best professional decision
Good
I've
recovery.
ever made in my life. Yeah. I mean, there's no chance she's going to listen to this. I think I'm in the clear anyway. But she's probably got ears everywhere. Where was I? Anyway, so I turn up at this school and like the level that these guys are operating. So I was head of department there, of a department that was really struggling through nobody's fault. Basically, it's not. They don't like calling it a turnaround school because I think that quite fairly does disservice to the teachers who were there before. So I think it's fair and reasonable not to call it a turnaround, but it is a school whose progress massively accelerated within a couple of years from historically low outcomes to very good outcomes. And that's really struggled sorting out the science department, struggled to recruit, lost the head of department. The year before I joined, there were 3 science teachers. One was the acting head of science, one was in her first year of Teach First, and the other only joined in Easter. So it was not in a good place. The way I like to put it is that there were science teachers, but there was no science department, because you can't no one can function under those circumstances. It's just not feasible. So I joined, and we took on another Teach First. I call them kids. It's a bit mean. A Teach First kid in his first year, and that first term was brutal. It was so hard. It was a new job, which is new school is always difficult. New department is always difficult. Head of department is always, step up to a different leadership position is always going to be difficult. The context of the school was more difficult. I was moving from a school which was like 5 to 10% pupil premium to one that's 40 to 50%, close to 50% EAL, just a totally different environment. It's like a different world, and an SLT who were pushing me really, really hard. We were also moving house at the time. We then had to live with my in-laws, and then had to live with my parents, and then had to live with my in-laws. And the house we were moving into was a building sign, then it got broken into. It was all just complete, like everything that could have gone wrong in that first term went wrong. And I thought I was doing a really bad job. And my boss, who is, the best teacher I've ever worked with, and the best manager I've ever worked with, just kept pushing me and supporting me and pushing me and supporting me. And I got better at every single aspect of my job: teaching, leading, curriculum, behavior, everything, more quickly than any other period. And for a teacher who was in their 5th year of teaching, who had basically spent the last 5 years breezing observations with that one notable exception, not having a real problem, and then just being pushed so much harder and just getting better so much more quickly was like enervating and invigorating. And the department were, I couldn't see it at the time. I find it really difficult to see what, my big leadership flaw is that I'm not good at seeing the improvements where they're happening. I'm always too fixed on what things could be like, and it means that I'm not good at seeing how far things have come. which is not good, because it means that I'm not sensitive to small changes. So that's like a thing, I'm working on a whole bunch of stuff with leadership. I think leaders are always working on things, but that's one of the things long term that I need to be focusing on. My boss assured me that things were getting better and were getting better and were getting better, but I couldn't see it. And then just like at the end of January, we'd like turned a corner and like things were getting into a bit of a flow. And it took us till the end of January. This is like 5 or 6 months. And like we'd just turned the corner with year 10, who were a really tricky year group. Things were just starting to work out with year 11, and then boom, COVID hit us in the face. And of course, because we were a department that historically didn't have much by way of routines, habits, structure, culture, all of that, COVID hit us harder than others. So like the maths department, who already had routines and culture and strategies and relationships and all of that in place, were, obviously, like lockdown was hard, but the engagement from the students was better. For us, it was worse, because students weren't used to working for us. Students weren't used to spending time at home working in science. They weren't used to having they weren't used to high expectations being had of them in science, and it meant that lockdown was really difficult. And now we are where we are now. The last term was also really hard. The lockdown was really hard, but it is what it is. Does that cover it?
almost to the minute. Perfect. Thank you. That's an unbelievably fulsome, comprehensive answer. I'm really interested, as you know, in this idea of significant learning, this idea of learning that shaped the behaviour of the individual over the period of their life. And we've touched upon a few things there. I think it would make sense to focus on, if I may, to suggest three aspects of things that you've sort of touched upon in that response. It feels like you've had quite sort of pivotal moments within your journey. One being about behaviour. We haven't really talked about that much yet. I think the first one we'll talk about is maybe discovery learning, because you mentioned that briefly, and how you did this 180 flip. And the third one is marking, because you don't do any marking, do you? Or there's very little sort of what most people would recognise as normal, sort of the normal approach to written feedback in books. And that's something that I think that people would be really interested in. So this first one, discovery learning. You said that you read this piece. So Coe et al. 2014 wrote this sort of review, What Makes Great Teaching. Was it the Sutton Trust that came out? I remember when it came out.
The Elliot Major, Rob Coe, and a couple of others,
Yeah, and it was this particular... So there was a section in there that was like, these are fads, right? These are things that have previously been thought to be a good idea that aren't. And the usual suspects were in there about learning styles. And I remember that praise was in there, like people that overusing praise isn't automatically a good idea. And then the other one was discovery learning, and you said that was the first time that you had ever heard anybody say that it's maybe not the best thing for young people to just discover everything.
Yeah, I think this is the closest in my life I'll ever get to a single moment of significant learning. I think most of the other things that I've spoken about are, I struggled a bit to put it into words, but it's like just the air that you breathe and just the culture and atmosphere that you put yourself into. So yeah, it was an important moment for me. I was already starting to think in different ways, because I got hold of that report via Twitter and stuff like that. But yeah, it just had this like throwaway passage that said, by the way, discovery learning sucks. It didn't say it in those words. And then from there, reference the famous and classic Kirshner 2006 piece, Kirshner, Swell and Clark, Why Minimal Instruction Doesn't Work, the failure of discovery, inquiry-based, social constructivist pedagogies, that kind of thing. Which that article is peer-reviewed, and as a scientist, peer review is important to me. That article was definitely a polemic. It wasn't a piece of research. It is a polemic, but it references research. And it references randomized control trials, which I didn't know were a thing in education. I'd read a lot of education research. I'd never read a randomized control trial. And as a scientist and someone who took public science really closely, it was really important to me. The idea that, I knew that randomized control trials with double blinds and the like were considered the gold standard in medicine. I didn't realize that they'd been done in education. And then all of a sudden I'm reading stuff that's really questioning those kind of basic assumptions, and then reading more about cognitive load theory, what it is, how it works, and why. So it's not just saying empirically, we know from randomized control trials it doesn't work, but also like we have a good cognitive model to explain why it doesn't work because of knowledge deficits and the working memory model. And then moving from there to kind of other sources of evidence like the PISA 2015 longitudinal study on science learning that ranked science inquiry learning as having a more negative correlational effect on student outcomes than not being in school, which is quite like, it's got this mad table where it lists everything that has an impact on student outcomes in science. And like right down there at the bottom, there's a bar that says missed time at school. And then underneath that is inquiry learning. So of course it is correlational, it's not causational, but it's always good to triangulate evidence and the like. But anyway, and then I also started realizing in my classes that actually when I was doing stuff like that, kids weren't getting it and they weren't understanding stuff and they were embedding misconceptions, they were making a lot of mistakes. So yeah, that was, and it's important to know, by the way, that doesn't mean that inquiry and discovery aren't good techniques. It means they're not good techniques for novice learners. So they are, so to start with, in the cognitive load theory literature, they distinguish quite tenuously, it's not tenuous, but it's questionable, the distinction between biologically primary and secondary knowledge. So for example, children do learn stuff by discovery, like how to recognize faces, like my son who's just started swallowing. I didn't teach him to swallow. He just kind of worked it out by himself. And they learn how to talk. Even though there is guidance from teachers and people around them, broadly, like they learn how to talk by themselves and how to listen by themselves. It's not the same as sitting down and learning how to balance an equation. But reading and writing, no child learns by themselves. Well, you might have major outliers, but broadly you need formal instruction for reading and writing. And whether you're whole words or systematic synthetic phonics or whatever, everybody agrees there has to be instruction. No one's like, just give kids books and they'll work it out.
Some people say that, but not there are not many.
That's very far out to the edges. You'll find someone who says everything, who says, there'll always be someone to say every potty idea under the sun, but broadly, like, it's not mainstream in the slightest. And so discovery learning there's this thing called the expertise reversal effect, which is as you become more expert in a subject, the techniques which work best for you to learn by are reversed. So the classic example is a worked example. So if I want to teach my students how to, say, balance an equation or solve weight equals mass times gravity, I do that via a worked example. And I do the worked example slowly, deliberately, and carefully. Then we do another worked example together. Then they might do a faded example where they've got bits and pieces of a worked example. They need to fill in the rest. And then finally, when they're ready, they do independent practice. That's really good for novice learners. But if I took like a physics expert, someone who's already a boss at physics, and I wanted to teach them a new equation, the way to do that would not be by a worked example. I'd say, this is the new equation. This is what the bits mean. And they'd be fine. And they'd go off and work out the rest by themselves. And in fact, if I tried making them use a worked example, I'd actually slow them down and intellectually hinder them. And the same is true of discovery and inquiry learning, that when you're first starting out, discovery is a very, very poor way to learn. An explicit instruction being taught by a teacher is much better. Whereas as you progress further in your knowledge and expertise, it's better for you to be moving towards, figuring stuff out for yourself. Like if you are a researcher in a particular area, so like you do research in oracy, right? Yeah. So if someone, it wouldn't be a good idea for you to go to Neil Mercer talking to the PGCE students at the IOE, giving the introductory talk about oracy. Like, you're not going to learn anything like that, right? It's just, you're going to sit there for 50 minutes thinking, well, I know all this. And even if he was teaching stuff that you knew already, right, what would take him an hour and a half with the PGCE students, you could sit down with the paper and do in 10 minutes. Right? Now, not to say you wouldn't benefit from hearing a master of their craft, etc., etc. In principle, if you talk about raw learning and raw outcomes, like, it would be better for you to just sit down with the paper and read it rather than have someone standing up and giving a lecture about it with dodgy slides for an hour and a half. Mm-hmm. So it does flip. So it's not the case that discovery learning and inquiry learning is always bad. It's just it's a time and a place type thing. So when students don't know a lot about a subject, then discovery is a bad idea. When they do know a lot about a subject, then it becomes a better idea.
Yes, yeah, and I mean that's an interesting point, and I think that we'll come on to that later on, because it's something that I'm really interested. I'm a learning to learner, right? Like my whole thing is that I really think that the best thing that we can do is to teach kids how to teach themselves, because once they leave school, regardless of what exam results they get, there's not going to be a teacher there to tell them what to do and how, and to set low stakes tests and to make sure that all this stuff sort of beautifully furnishes their mind and their long-term memory. And so I think that we need to somehow figure out where that point of balance is. And I know that, so something that's interesting that came up the other day when we were talking was about how the maths department at your school has got these incredible results, and they do it through a like collaborative learning group work type pedagogy.
Yeah. They do a lot of group work. It is worth noting that anytime they want to explain something, they do use explicit instruction, right? So worked examples and the like, they don't do any of this. I remember watching a video on Teachers TV where like it was an outstanding video. Do you remember Teachers TV? Right, a video of an outstanding teacher teaching Pythagoras theorem, and he had a golf ball and he had cricket bats, and they were out on the field running around and stuff, and they were trying to derive Pythagoras theorem for themselves, right, without him telling them what it was, and which is exactly the kind of nonsense that I used to do, by the way. And they would never do that in my maths department. They're like, this is Pythagoras' theorem, this is how it's applied. But then the individual work and the practice is all done collaboratively, and this is only a part of their success. They have many other, they do some amazing things. Their pedagogy is very strong. They have these things called chants, which are like it's basically a metacognitive strategy for solving any given problem. So essentially, they've taken every problem that a student could ever be asked at GCSE maths and turned it into a set of 50 to 60 heuristics, which are chants. So, for example, they would say of in maths means, and the kids would go times. Well, what does that mean? That means if you've got a question that says, what is half of 360? That means half times 360, because of in maths means times, right? And they've got loads of them. They become way more sophisticated than that. So a really nice one that we use a lot in the science department actually is successful elimination. So I say successful elimination, the kids go back inverse operation, and that's how you rearrange an equation, or how you do a linear rearrangement. It's really clever. They have ones like the box method is like 4 or 5 different levels, and it's basically a decision tree. So here's a good one: right angle triangle, and you go right angle triangle, and the kids go Pythagoras or trig. So if you see a right angle triangle, it's always going to be Pythagoras or trig, right? And then basically the next level of the chant are about them figuring out if it's Pythagoras or trig, and if it's trig, how to solve it, and if it's Pythagoras, how to solve it. It's by the way, it's the only time everyone talks about metacognition these days. It's the only time I've ever actually seen it in play and being a sensible thing rather than just like woolly fluff. So like these kids, like they really think about the strategies. So that's what, one of the things they do there. But they do the group work, but like the peer-to-peer accountability is so strong. So they might ask a question and the kids on a table will write all their answers on the mini whiteboards or whatever. And if one kid on the table gets it wrong and another kid gets it right, they'll have a massive go at the kid who got it right for not explaining to the kid who got it wrong where they're going wrong. So they do the peer-to-peer accountability, they do the kind of social learning, but the way they do it is better, and is not just better, it's orders of magnitude better than anyone elsewhere I've seen. And like I don't teach like that. No, not necessarily just because of personal affects, but also I don't actually think I'm good enough to do that yet. And it might be that one day I'm like, oh, you know what? I can start doing things the way that they do things, but I'm not there yet. I'm definitely not there yet.
Okay, let's come on to behaviour management, because this is something that you talk about a lot, and again it's something that you seem to have thought about a lot, and something that I thought was really interesting that I read was that you hate it because you hate sort of doing it, you hate having to deal with it, you don't dislike the process of having to exert your authority on young people and so on. How were you as a behaviour manager? Like my first few years of teaching were not good behaviourally. It was just, I was shouting a lot. It often felt like I was shouting at my own lack of planning, which is not very nice feeling. And I wasn't working in a school where there was even particularly a behaviour management policy. We would often get undermined, and you send a kid out and they get sent straight back into your lesson, and it was hard. And I sort of had to learn my own way of figuring out how to get through the week without falling apart. What sort of the journey that you've been on with regard to behaviour?
So at the first school that I taught at, behaviour generally was good, but it wasn't perfect. And definitely if you were like young or new or inexperienced, or sadly to say, like, if basically there were like levels, right? Of things that will contribute to you having worse behavior in your classes, right? Being young is one, being inexperienced is another, being new to a school is another, being junior in rank is another, sadly being female is another, having an accent is another, all of the above, right? Being a small person can make it. And again, I'm not saying that like there aren't small female teachers with accents who dominate their classes. There obviously are, but like on average, these things make it harder for you. And I think at first I was very much like, I need to plan more engaging lessons so these students behave. And then I started moving away from that when I started reading Andrew Old's blog. So Andrew Old, who's a horribly contentious fellow, and has a very idiosyncratic online mannerism. But he wrote quite powerfully about behavior back in the day, and he was basically just talking about student choice. And he put it quite simply that, like, if you say that the behavior is because of you and it's your fault, then you're robbing the child of any agency. And you're saying, like, it was inevitable that they would misbehave. And like they don't have like a moral, agency is the right word. Moral agency is you saying a person has free will and the choice to do right or wrong. And essentially, if you're saying that it's all about you and what you do, then that kind of vanishes, because you're saying that the child would have inevitably misbehaved because my lesson wasn't engaging enough. And I think that's like a really powerful moral proposition, and I veered quite strongly over to that side. And then, of course, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. I had a particular class who I learned the most from. Again, it was in this first school. They were year 7, but they were babies. Right, so everyone who's taught year 7 knows that in every class you'll have 1 or 2 kids maybe who aren't quite secondary ready, bless them. And like, that's part of the job and it's part of the fun. And the kids who just like get up and wander around the classroom for no apparent reason, or the kids who ask you if they can turn over the page, that kind of student. And this was a class by laws of fixed probability. It's inevitable that you will have one class that instead of having a critical mass of students who are secondary ready, you have a critical mass of students who aren't secondary ready. And these kids, bless them, like, they were lovely. They weren't badly behaved. They were just all over the place. They just like, they didn't know how to focus. They didn't know how to learn. They didn't understand the expectations that there were of them. And they would just do weird stuff, like not because they were misbehaving, just because they didn't know it was the wrong thing to do. And when there were so many of them, it like became quite difficult to manage, and I got quite frustrated. And I started just massively slowing things down for them. And I started saying things to them like, okay, I would like everybody in this classroom to put your hands up in the air like this, and then put them flat on the table in front of you. Thank you. Now that means your hands are going to stay flat. You're not going to pick up your pens. You're not going to pick up your scissors and start cutting random stuff. You're just going to have your hands on the table, and you're going to be looking and listening to me. And then basically, like, it worked. It really, really worked. And by like almost micromanaging their behaviors in like a nice way, and not in a way that was like I was saying, I will give you a 4-hour detention if you ask me again if you can turn the page, that kind of thing. It was more like, you don't need to ask me if you can turn the page, just do it when you're ready. It was like preemptive and proactive rather than reactive. Yeah. And like, I wasn't making my lessons any more engaging or anything. I was just like breaking stuff down and being really slow and being really attentive to what they were doing. And behavior got a lot better. And then I was like, well, why don't I just try this with other classes? And it was hard with other classes, but like their behavior improved as well. And by like being really like careful about the way that I was saying things and the way that I was attending to them, It made like quite a big difference. I then moved to my second school, and it went downhill massively very fast because, do you remember I said there were the 6 or 7 things, right? One of them is moving to a new school. The first lesson in that new school, I was, I know I've said this twice, but like, I don't want you to feel like I'm some kind of like loose cannon, but I was basically ready to call my old head and ask for my old job back. It was so bad. Like, there were kids wandering around, they were like pushing each other, they weren't listening to me, they were calling out, they were being rude to each other. It was an absolute nightmare. Right. To be fair, it was a very difficult class. To this day, it's still a class that I would have struggled with. But, it made me feel pretty bad about myself. And then slowly again, things started improving across those 3 years. At some point, I started reading some Doug Lemov and realizing that some of the things that I were doing were things that he spoke about in his book. But I didn't need to accelerate my progress in that area too much because I was okay. I then came to the new school, and even though like I was still in a decent position, even though I was new to the school and new head of department, I was much more firm and secure in the way that I was doing things. But I was then supervising others, and I was then getting to the point where I had to give others feedback to make them improve. And essentially, I had to distill the stuff that I was doing into a way, things that I was doing naturally without thinking about. I had to distill those into like a firm step or action that somebody else could understand and carry out. And it wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough to just like wishy-washy, flimmy-flammy say it's like when I walk around the class, like I try and move in a way that where like I'm doing, I don't really know, I want to try and like look at everybody, right, is much slower and less effective than saying Pastel's perch. And my trainees both know, well, they're not trainees anymore, they're both NQTs now. They know if I say Pastel's perch, they know that they should have gone to a particular area in the room. They should have, which is where they can see the most number of students without any being in their periphery. And then I can say, be seen looking radar. And they'll know that what they should have done is craned their head around and moved their head and their neck so that every student in the room knows that they're watching. Every student in the room knows that they are a part of this lesson. A really good example, something again that I didn't even notice until I videoed it. There was a student who was talking very quietly. No, sorry, what was it? Hang on, let me think. Just give me a second. Yeah. So there were 2 things. There was a student who was talking very quietly, and I stepped towards the student because I couldn't hear them. And then just got on with the lesson. But then the video showed that like a whole bunch of other students stopped listening at that point. They're just like, wandered off. And the reason for that was because I'd effectively zoned them out of the class. Yeah. Right. If I can't hear the kid, they can't hear the kid. And when I step closer to the kid, not only are they still not being able to hear, but I'm actively saying to them, this part of the lesson is not for you. Right. And the same happened when somebody misbehaved. So I would be talking to one student, and then someone in the other corner of the room would start messing around. And I'd turn around and I'd say, stop doing that. It's not okay, or whatever. I said, do it again, you get detention, something like that. And then I went back to the first kid who was then talking to the person next to him. And I'm like, how did that happen? Right. And this is a very common occurrence where like you're talking to one kid about the learning. You then turn to a different kid who's misbehaving. You come back to the first kid and they're not listening to you anymore. Well, why is that? Because you've zoned them out. They're not part of this part of the lesson anymore. You're going to talk to somebody else, and you've cued them to thinking this isn't part of your lesson. So instead, what I did is so the next time that happened, I put out my hand towards the student who I had been talking to, and I said, just hold tight a second. And I kept that hand there, and then I turned just my head and neck to the student who was messing around. So my hand is still facing that first student, and I say, do that again, you'll have a detention. And then I turn very quickly back to the first student. And just that like physicality and that body and verbal language of saying, this conversation is just paused, right? I'm coming back to you very soon, right? Is kind of, that meant that he didn't turn around and start talking to the person next to him because he still felt that he was part of a lesson. And this kind of all led me on to like the Doug Lemov umbrella technique of things like ratio, which is the way that you keep everyone in your class with you and paying attention. So ratio is about the number of students who are paying attention at any given time, and the techniques you can use to make sure that number is high. So and sometimes it's obvious. So cold call, when you ask a question, you don't say, Daniel, what is the formula for hydrogen? Because everybody else who isn't Daniel stops listening. You say, what is the word equation for hydrogen, Daniel? And that way nobody knows who's going to get picked, right? So that's a good way of building your ratio, making sure everyone's paying attention. But there's also more subtle ones. So for example, my NQT last year, she was brilliant. She unfortunately has left the profession. I'm trying to get her back, and I'll get there eventually. But she was brilliant, and she was in the middle of a year 11 lesson with a tricky bunch. And there was a student who messed around. She was in the middle of an explanation which goes A, B, C, D. Right, and there was a student, she had just done B, and there was a student who messed around, and she did a very calm, quiet interaction with this girl. She said, please just stand up and go. And the girl was like, she's like, just go. And the girl got up and went. And then she carried on from C. And I said to her afterwards, I said, look, you dealt with it calmly, which is right. You dealt with it using an economy of language, which is right. You didn't get into a long conversation with her, which is right. What you didn't do is realize that the second that interaction happens, everybody else in the class is paying attention to that interaction and not to you and your explanation, right? What you should have done is the student leaves and you say, right, I want everyone to pay attention back over here, please. Eyes up here. I'm sorry that happened. I'm not talking about it. Back to the top, and then go back A, B, C, D. But if you pick up from C, which is where you left off, all of your kids have broken their attention. They're thinking about something else. They're thinking about this girl who's just been kicked out. What was it that she did? Is she going to get in more trouble? And all of the stuff that they know that you don't know, like, the baggage that this girl might have had brought to the lesson. They might know that this girl is on a last warning from ahead of year that you don't know. All of that stuff, right, that is now, boom, in their heads. And what's not in their heads is A, B, C, and D. And that means if you carry on from C, if they can't remember, or A and B have just gone from their heads, they're not going to be able to access C, they're not going to be able to access D, they're not participating in your lesson, and your ratio goes down. And these words like ratio and cold call and pastor's perch, be seen looking, 3:30:30, all of the words that we use like as a matter of course are so powerful at like front loading, like we spoke about before, means of participation. They're so powerful for just like guiding those micro movements that lead to big changes both in the behavior of your class and in their academics, because you've got more of them thinking at the same time. Now, a lot of people criticize this stuff because it's like micromanaging, it's overly controlling, and all of that stuff. And yeah, like I guess maybe it's not for everyone. Maybe it's not. And you know what? Some of the stuff that you see on the videos from the Lamov schools, the uncommon, what they call the uncommon schools.
Uncommon schools.
Yes, look, some of it's weird, slant. I find slant a bit strange, right? Slant is the sit up straight and listen and stuff, and the track. So T is for track.
Teacher, yeah.
You know what? I do find it a bit weird. But I do ask students to look at me because that's the way that I know. Well, I've got a better chance of knowing that they're paying attention. Obviously, like if I've got autism, kids with autism, autistic kids, like I'm not going to make them make eye contact, all of that stuff. Yeah, fine, right? There are obviously exceptions, and that's another one of the criticisms. People are like, how dare you do this to autistic kids? I'm like, well, I'm not a monster, right? I personally find that doing it this way, even though I am like, I guess the way that I think about it is, I have really bad eczema on my hands, right? It's a curse, right? In the winter, every year, my eczema flares up and it gets really bad. I can't, some days I can't close my hands, right? And I know that I need to use the cream that the doctor's prescribed me. That's before my bed. I put it on every evening, but I also need to moisturize throughout the day using my Epiderm cream. Now, if I have one tub of Epiderm and it's downstairs and I'm working in the loft and I realize, I need to moisturize my hands. Well, I'm not going to go, am I? Right? Or I'm going to go less frequently. So what do? I get another tub of Epiderm and I put it on my desk at work. I buy another one from Amazon. I put it on the desk right next to me. And it's much easier. I just reach over and I just do the pump and I put the cream on and I'm done. And so I have 4 or 5 tubs of Epiderm that I have in various places. I have one at my desk at work. I have one on my desk at home, one next to my bed, and one downstairs. And it just means that actually I end up moisturizing more. Right? I think behavioral scientists call it like a nudge. It's a nudge theory, right? It's like a small change, right? That you're not robbing anyone of their free will. You're not taking their autonomy away. You're not being nobody would say to me, oh, the way you've done it. Yeah, why can't you just want to moisturize more? Right? If you want to moisturize enough, then you'll go downstairs and you'll do the moisturizing. You need to get students to just want to behave more, and then they will just choose to behave. And I'm like, look, you know what? Maybe for some kids it works. Maybe for some teachers it works. I don't know. But if I can put the tub of moisturizer there, then why would I not just do that? If it's just going to make things a lot easier for everybody. And there's this concept in Greek virtue ethics called acrasia. Do you know acrasia?
No.
So acrasia is reformulated by Jesus as the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Right? Acrasia is basically where like you really want to do the right thing, you just don't. You just end up not doing it. I would argue, right, that in most schools, most of the time, like 99% of the kids, they want to do the right thing. And when you have that chat with them afterwards, you're like, what was the right thing to do? And they're like, not called out. You say, what did you do? Called out. So was that the right thing to do? No. Like, why did you do it? I don't know. So I just did it. Like, do you want to do it? Like, if you like what's going on? He's like, so I'm sorry, I didn't want to do. Like, I don't know. Right? These kids are, they're lovely and they're sweet and they're brilliant and all of that, and they want to do the right thing, but the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak, and like mistakes end up happening, and they do things that are wrong. I would much, much, much prefer to have a situation where I'm telling students to look at me, then have to give them a detention. And if that's if that's the choice, like obviously I'm going to take it, because I don't think the other approaches of like being their mate or doing like engaging lessons or like someone wrote in the Chartered College of Teaching's guide for like new teachers, it was published a couple of years ago. Someone said, someone who is considered an authority in behavior management said that it's a good idea for new teachers, PGC and NQTs, to like go out into the playground at lunch and like talk to the kids and get to know them more, and like that way like the behavior will be better. And I'm like, nonsense. I'm like where, like I have very good relationships with some of my toughest students who cause me the most grief. Right, very good relationships, and I'd have a conversation with them afterwards, and I'd be like, "I'm sorry, like I know, it was wrong thing to do. I deserved the detention or whatever." Right, like the relationship is there; it's always there. And to be sure, there are a couple of students who I struggle with my relationship with them, and they might also misbehave. Fine. My point is that like it just doesn't necessarily mean there'll be any difference. Like, why is it that students behave perfectly in the exam hall, right? They got their GCSE exams, right? You'll have some very small exceptions, but it's the least engaging, most boring, most difficult, most arduous, most anxiety-inducing, longest, right? A lot of them have to sit there for an hour and a half, right? That period of their lives, right? There's no relationship with the paper. There's no relationship with the invigilator who's paid to just like wander up and down the columns. And yet the behavior is great, right? Relationships are like so important. There's so many teachers get into the job because of relationship. Like if I couldn't build a relationship with my kids, like I wouldn't be able to teach, sure. But like it also has very, very little correlation with what actually happens in terms of behavior management in the classroom. However, the stuff that I do, the micro movements and the way that I phrase my instructions and my precision of language and the place where I stand and the things that I do with my body language do make a big difference. So I don't think if you asked my students, you said, do you feel like Mr. Boxer is too controlling? I don't think they'd say that. I think if you said to them, what's behavior like in Mr. Boxer's lesson? They'd say it's very good. And they said, are you happy with that or sad with that? And they'd say, I think I'm pretty happy with that because I don't mess around. And I mess around in other classes, but I don't mess around with him. It's not because I'm scary. I'm not a scary guy. I really not. I'm not one of those naturals, the big beast who just like wanders into a class and boom, everyone's quiet. Like they've got that like natural air about them. I don't have that. I've worked really, really hard, and I've had to work really hard to get to the place where I am because I hate dealing with it, and it stresses me out and it makes me upset, and I carry it home with me. There've been times where like I've had to punish a kid because when like really bad, like I can't go into details, but when like really bad stuff happens in school and you have to follow through on it and you just really, really don't want to, you really want to give the kid another chance. But there are times where sadly you just can't, things like that. You really don't want to have to give them that attention. You don't want to have to make that phone call to the mum. I've had my parents in tears down the phone to me. Like nobody wants that, right? If I can avoid that just by telling a student to look at me, then you're damn right I'm going to do that. And if someone comes into my class and tells me I'm being too authoritarian and there's a panopticon going on here, okay, c'est la vie. Look, you take over, you show me how it's done. But for the minute, I'm more than happy.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a bit long. That was a bit of a rant.
No, it's good. I know that behavior management is something that's important in your work, and with me as well. And it's funny that we were talking about progressive and traditionalism earlier, and often like people sort of, when I think of trad and prog, I think of it in terms of classroom practices and pedagogy, but people often sort of lump in behaviour management with it as though like a progressive educationalist has to just believe in sort of quite permissive approaches to just letting kids do what they want to do, and having restorative approaches to, instead of detentions and so on. And I don't have a problem with having really firm boundaries and with learning these micro tools. And obviously, it doesn't matter what I think. Like you were just mentioning Doug Lemov and Teach Like a Champion, and the popularity of those books. I know he's writing version 3 at the moment, is insane. And obviously, there's a huge hunger and thirst, or whatever it is, out in the teaching profession for information about how can I do this better, the nitty gritty, the day-to-day running of a classroom, and it's a massive problem. As I said, as somebody who struggled for many years with behaviour management in a school that was not good at organising it, it's no fun, man. And we know that there's huge retention problems in schools, and workload and behaviour are the two big things, aren't they? Which brings us neatly to workload. Let's just touch on this briefly, and then we'll talk about some positives, some challenges, some fixes to those challenges, and then we'll get back to our carpaccio of beef. So, I know that you've done a lot of work on, I saw there was something that you mentioned earlier, that there was an annex to your policy, and I remember that you'd written something. Was it a report for governors a while ago that was about reviewing the literature, and you're like, I don't think that there's much of a case for written feedback. And as I understand it, you don't really do any, or is it all very much written feedback in your classes or in your department? And I think that people will be very pleased to and intrigued to hear more about this.
Yeah, so that document was called Markageddon.
That was it.
Yeah, I don't know how I came up with the name, but we'll run with it. It's definitely catchy. I think like most teachers, I've always hated marking. And, it's really important to point out that I'm a science teacher, and most of what I say is about science. And I don't, there's not much evidence for any subject, but like in terms of my own practice, I can't talk outside of science. And I just always felt like it was a waste of time. Like it was done just because it had to be done, but not because it was actually doing anything to the students in terms of their learning. And I used to fall asleep marking stuff, and my attention would wander. And it's a kind of job that, the first thing might take you 2 minutes to mark, and then the second one might also be 2 minutes. But by the time you get to the 10th, it's taking you 4 minutes, and you're going to have a coffee break halfway through. It's just like, it's a nightmare task. It's awful, awful, awful. And I always hated it. And I was fairly confident it wasn't doing much. And then the government said that we're going to have this big review into marking. And then the Education Endowment Foundation published a big thing about marking, saying there's no evidence that it works. And also I think I read in one of David Didow's blogs that even from a logical perspective, if let's say a kid writes an answer to a given question and you give them some written feedback and then they improve their answer, all they've shown is that given a specific piece of feedback on a specific piece of work, they've made a specific improvement. You've not necessarily moved the kid forward, right? You've moved the kid forward given a specific comment. So, even logically, I didn't really see the point. I just hated doing it so much. It's I hate doing behavior management, but at least I'm I see the value in it, right? So I never saw the value in marking, and I'd be constantly ranting and raving about it to anybody who would listen, including my vast superiors. And at one point, the head, who I mentioned before, he was like, why don't you just come present to governors? Because he was the head of a very middle class school, and children and their parents expect a certain standard of quality, and they expect a certain service, because that's what they think they're getting, even though they're not. Well, they are paying technically, but it's whatever. That's the vagaries of middle class parenting. We can do another time. But anyway, they expected marking, so they said, "Come along to the governors and have a go." So I went away and I wrote up this thing and I presented. I don't think anything changed as a result of it, but it got thousands of hits. People were very, very interested. And then when I joined my new school, we believe strongly in principles of self-determination theory, which is the self-determination of a person is essentially their self-affect, the way they view themselves. And it's originally Ryan and Deci. There's a couple of papers around 2000, 2001 that you'll probably be familiar with. And they established, so it's popularized by Daniel Pink in his book Drive, which is actually bought by everyone at my school. for everyone at my school by the head. So before you start, he buys you a copy of Drive and asks you to read it. Daniel Pink, great ideas about psychology, terrible ideas about education, but that's for another time as well. And sorry, I'm actually just going to close that. Sorry, stop it pinging again. Anyway, so the three pillars are relationships or purpose, autonomy, and mastery. So the more like you feel like related to people, or you understand the purpose of your work, the more motivated you're going to feel towards it. Mastery is about the better you feel about how things are going, the more motivated you are. If things are going badly, then obviously you don't feel particularly motivated. It's what I call the parallel park, which is where like when you first learn to drive, you hate parallel parking and everybody does. And then once you like get good at parallel parking, you're like, challenge accepted, and like you go for like a really difficult parallel park. I don't know if maybe it's a male thing. I don't know. You get out of the car, you're like, yeah, smashed it, and then like that's mastery. That's what mastery is. It's because you're good at something, you like enjoy doing it, and you relish the challenge. And then the third pillar is autonomy, which is about people's ability to make decisions about their own work and about their own life. We treasure all three at school, and we treasure intrinsic motivation. So you spoke about praise a bit earlier from the co-report. We don't do reward points. We don't have reward points. We don't do raffles. We eschew completely if then rewards. So I would never be allowed, if my head walked in to my classroom and I said, okay, if you do this really well, then I will give you X, Y, or Z. And it might be a chocolate or a reward point or whatever. He'd go mad at me, because that is exactly what we don't do. We give out recognitions, which are now that rewards. So now that a person has done something, we will recognize it.
Yeah.
And so the kids get surprise rewards. So like we might take 50 kids in year 8 who their teachers have said always do smashing homework, and just give them a pizza party, because they won't know it's coming, but it's a now that reward anyway. So one of the things that we treasure as well is, of course, this autonomy and people being able to make as many decisions as they can about their life. So like my boss would be more than happy if we could like choose our own hours and be flexible, but obviously that's not on the cards. So we do what we can. So one example of where we apply autonomy is departmental teaching and learning. So every department is entitled to their own teaching and learning policy. We have some whole school prerequisites like using cold call and stretch it, right is right, and no opt out, which are Douglas strategies. Things like explicitly modeling stuff is a whole school prerequisite, but again, like the way you model would be down to your teaching and learning, your departmental teaching and learning policy. And I said to my boss that I didn't want to mark anything ever, and he was like, okay, here's the pushback. And he said, right, how are you going to know what students know and what they don't? How are you going to give them feedback? And those are the two questions I had to answer. Now, I think personally that marking is a terrible answer to those two questions. But theoretically, that's what marking is trying to do. It's trying to get you to see the students' work, and it's trying to get you to give them feedback. So I said, look, what we'll do is we do circulating in class, which is where you go around and like purposefully, you don't just like wander around, but you like purposefully look at students' work. You do sampling when you do your questioning. You use mini whiteboards extensively, and all of that is a way of getting information about what students know. We do regular mini quizzes, which are spaced, so they're based on material they learned a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 6 months ago, 2 years ago. We do fortnightly short assessments. And we do the carousel stuff. So we're now checking loads of their work that they're doing online. So that's how we see the work that they're doing, and we give them feedback the whole time. But we do that feedback in a way that benefits more students than just one. So if there's an area that like one student's made and it's very niche, then yeah, I'll give the feedback to that student by themselves, verbally, not in writing, because it takes longer, and there's no point to it. But if there's a mistake that like a few kids are having, so this is again like a classic rookie error, where you do your explain or whatever, and then the kids do some work, and you notice that there's a mistake that a kid makes, and you tell the kid where they went wrong and how to rectify. You then move on to the next kid, they've made a very similar mistake, and you tell them where they went wrong, and then you've got hands going up left, right, and center, and you go to each one, and you're like, okay, telling them what went wrong, what was wrong. So that's like a novice error, and then like a better teacher would maybe like notice that this is a class error and would like pull the class back and would say, oh, if you got question 2 right, keep going. but for everybody else, I want you to listen to me. I think that's also an error. It's just less of a rookie error. A more experienced teacher would bring the whole class back and explain and say, right, a lot of people misunderstood that, so we're going to go over that together as a class, and would then let the students go do some more work. Again, I still think that's an error, because an even better teacher would pull the whole class back and would explain it again, and would then do a check for understanding via a mini whiteboard or via a series of 2 or 3 questions before letting them go back to the first question that they all got wrong. So I'm giving tons of feedback, right? Loads of it.
Yeah.
Kids are getting feedback the whole time in my classes. I have an open door policy, not at the moment because of COVID, but in general, I have an open door policy. Anyone from anywhere is more than welcome to send me an email and spend the day sat in the back of my classroom. And if you walk out of it, there are plenty of things that I can improve about my practice for sure. But if you go out of my classroom and you say that the volume of feedback wasn't sufficient and that marking would provide the students with more feedback, then I will eat my hat if you're correct. But you won't be correct, so I will not eat my hat.
Yeah. I'm persuaded, and it's something that I really welcome that's happening more widely, not widely enough yet, I don't think, that people are starting to engage more with verbal feedback in lessons and less written feedback that often does feel, my goodness, the verbal feedback stamp, there was a teacher tap question recently that asked, to what extent, are you, and it was 45% of teachers are still, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is still a thing. And it's clear, there's never been clear evidence of that marking is about covering your arse, and it's about accountability and not about doing what's right by the kids. Because how has a kid ever benefited from a verbal feedback stamp? Like, it's just outrageous.
Oh, child, what was that verbal feedback? Oh, I don't know. Do you know what VFG stands for? No idea. Who does it help? Look, things are slowly shifting, and in the government's 2019 workload survey, it showed that the hours teachers are working has dropped a bit, and they're so things are slowly turning around, and there are more teachers who have a bit more nous about them now, but it is still a very, very big problem. I think also it's not just about covering, but it's also a way of senior leadership who don't understand the content of a lesson. It's very easy for them to say, oh, well, you've done your marking, so all's good here. I'll never forget being observed by, I was observed by the head of English while I was teaching my A-level chemists. And she leafed through their folders, and she said to me after, she was like, I did not understand anything that was going on in the lesson in the slightest, but their folders look neat. And I'm like, well, whether or not their folders are neat is, of course, gives you some information about the individual students. Perhaps, maybe it might be relevant to some things. I don't know. I don't personally care all that much. But the actual principle of you sitting in my classroom of A-level chemists and expecting to be able to give me solid, workable feedback. Well, obviously, if you can see marking or you can't see marking, then it means you don't have to worry about what's actually happening in the lesson. You don't have to be able to understand the nucleophilic substitution mechanism, because you can just talk about the marking.
Yeah.
So I think there was a lot of that involved as well. It's just it's a terrible practice. It needs to die a death and be burned on the flames of eternity. Ofsted have been pretty clear that they don't give a fig about it. So hopefully things will change. But it's institutional, and institutions change slowly.
They do, and I think that my wife is a primary school teacher, and she marks everything that the kids do, and
it's worse than primary,
and always has done. But for her, she really wouldn't ever stop doing it. She doesn't. She now works in a school that's very laissez-faire with regard to policies, but she does it because she really thinks that it makes a difference, because she knows exactly what every kid has done and what they've made a mistake on, and it informs her teaching the next day. And I think that if it does work for you, then it's fine. And I don't think that it's necessarily I don't think anything is ever a universal bad. I love this emphasis on self-determination theory, and this again comes back to a sort of learning to learn idea that I just love for the system to become a lot more flexible and dynamic and responsive to sort of individual drives and needs. And obviously that's not easy, because like you say, there are some things that we're working within big inflexible institutions, and there's only a certain amount of give that can be given. But I do feel like there's more give that could be given, and maybe we'll come on to that shortly.
Yeah, so just quickly to pick up one thing, that part of the reason why I prefaced with I'm a secondary science teacher is because of people like your wife. I'm not going to tell her that she's not doing the right thing. If someone in my department came to me and said, Adam, I know it says in the policy that we don't do any marking, but I like taking all the kids' books home. I like marking them all. I like doing it, and I think it gives me information about what to do the next day. I wouldn't tell them to not do it, but I would say, okay, talk me exactly through the process. Talk me exactly through what information you're getting and exactly what actions you're taking afterwards. And I suspect that they would say that, I like it because it's my way of showing the students that I care about them. It's my way of getting an insight into what they're thinking about, what their knowledge of science is, and I'm able to pick up on misconceptions and build them into my planning next lesson. I said, okay, let's slow it down. You've got Year 8 Science 2 tomorrow. There's 30 kids in the class, okay? Why not just take 7 books? Take 7 books home with you. Read those 7 books. Don't put any pen in those books. Tell the students when you take them in, you say, I'm really sorry, I would love to take more of your books the whole time, but I can't because I'm too busy. I'll take you 7 this week. I'll take another 7 next week because I love seeing your work. I'm really grateful that you give me the chance to see such beautiful work. And I'll take another 7 the week after, etc., etc. And then you take them in, you look at the work. You don't need to put any pen in, right? You don't need to write anything in the individual books. Just on a separate sheet of paper, jot down some common errors. And I guarantee you that if there's something in one of those 7 books, it's going to have appeared somewhere else in someone else's book. Then you bring back the class the next day and say, I'm so grateful to Davey, to Kevy, to whoever for giving me their books. They're so lovely. They're such good work. I can tell you guys really understanding stuff. You're making amazing progress. Now, there is something that I wanted to pick up on. One student wrote this. Can you all look at what's written on the board, please? There's something that's wrong about that. I'd like you to think about what's wrong with that. And then you do think per share, or you ask a particular student or whatever, and then you do a follow-up practice. And then you've saved your evening, right? Because you've cut down your marking stack, not only from 30 books to 7 books, but you've also managed to cut out all the laborious actually writing in their book, but you've achieved exactly the same thing, right? So I don't know about primary. I don't know anything about primary because you have the same students all day. It might be different, whatever. But in my context, that is 100% what I would say to one of my colleagues, and I'd be surprised if they said to me, you know what, I still want to just do all 30 books every time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're taking baby steps in the right direction here as well. There was a lovely piece of research that was done by my colleague Mark Quinn at UCL in conjunction with Ross McGill, where they looked at, it was quite a small number of teachers in about I think there was 14 or 15 people on this program, and they did verbal feedback for a year, and they evaluated the impact of it. And the impact was no detrimental impact in terms of student progress, and the teachers clawed back hours and hours of time a week, which they then reinvested into planning really good lessons. It's not like they're just leaving at 3:30 and going home, right? So long may that continue, that trend. Okay, we're gonna turn the Rethinking Ed bit into a quick fire round, I think, because I've got one eye on the clock. We've just ticked over 2 hours.
I'll go quick.
So we're going to go with one thing that you think is really good, a positive, something that you see that's happening out in the system more widely. And this could be at the level of policy, at the level of schools, could be one thing that you saw a teacher do in your department. Something that you think is really good that you'd like to see more of. I'll just ask that for now, and then we'll do the other ones next.
Yeah, I mean, I know it sounds like biased and pretentious, but I think the growth in traditional teaching is a good thing, and I think the increasing both acceptability and promotion. So remember, there are people who deny this, but for a long time, the stuff that I do in the classroom was verboten. And if I did my normal lesson, if I did my normal lesson 15 years ago, I'd be getting an unsatisfactory. Right, I can't remember how they did the gradings 15 years ago, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
So there was a long time that stuff was verboten, and not even it was verboten, it just wasn't a thing. It just didn't happen. And everybody had their box of tricks that they would drag out whenever Ofsted came around, or there was an SLT learning walk or whatever. And I'm really glad that more and more so that on 2 levels, because I think the first thing is that I think it's a good thing that we don't have blanket verboten things, in the same way that my maths department managed to get group work and pull it off. I don't think, so when Gavin Williamson stands up and says, students should be facing the front, right, in every class anyway.
Yeah.
Right, well, they do in mine. And I do think on average it's better for behavior for students to be facing the front. But like my maths department has the 7th highest progress rate in the country, and their students, and they're working in a school with high pupil premium and high EAL, and all of their desks are in pods. Like, who do you think you are that telling them to make them straight? Now, I'm not saying, now don't get me wrong, I'm not one of the no best way crews, right? I'm not saying that means there's no best way and every teacher can just do whatever they like. Right? Those maths teachers are at the top of their game and they're working as a team, building a collective culture and all of that. On average, I do still think that desks are better facing the front, that kind of thing. But there does need to be some ability for people to have a professional conversation. And like that one about marking, I don't think that marking in general is a good idea. But if someone convinces me, if a member of my team says, you know what, I don't agree with you, and I do want to spend the time doing it, but just so that you know, I'll get everything else that you want me to do done first, and then I'll do the marking on top of that. Like, I'm not going to turn around and say no, right? Like, it's his choice or her choice. They're an adult. Like, they can make that decision about their own life. And also as a professional, if they say, yeah, that's what it is, okay, you know what? There has to be a point at which, in the same way that my boss said to me, when I said I don't want marking, he said, fine, you've got autonomy. I have to lend people a certain amount of autonomy as well. And the ability to make sensible decisions about what happens in your classroom based on evidence, I think, is a good thing. And the fact that Ofsted don't look at teaching style anymore and that kind of stuff, and I think that's a good thing. And obviously, of course, I do happen to think that the growing trend and fashion towards explicit instruction is a good thing. I think teachers who care more about explicit instruction, the quality of their explanation, the quality of student independent practice, retrieval practice over time, I think all of that will or should be good things in terms of educational outcomes. So I think that would probably be my good thing.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned a few things there, but it was broadly that things are moving in a traditionalist direction, and also twinned with sort of greater autonomy at school level and within a system level. You think that teachers seem to be growing into their boots a little bit and sort of taking less directions down from the DFE.
Baby steps.
Yeah, indeed, baby steps. Right. Challenges. What do you think are the biggest challenges, or one big challenge that you see that you think, I'd really like to see that fixed?
I mean, if we're living in cloud cuckoo land, then behavior would be the one to fix 100%. But that's a society problem, right? The reason why it's considered normal for students to misbehave in classes is completely mad. Like, if you go to Eton, right, the kids aren't misbehaving there, right? There are no behavior management strategies on show, right? Does Harrow School have a behavior policy? I don't know. Haberdashers boys down the road from me. It's a boys' school. What's behavior like there? Perfect. What? Because the teachers are better at behavior management? No, not at all. So, like, culturally, it's just become a thing that students misbehave. Like, there are countries where students do not misbehave in classrooms. There are schools where students do not misbehave, and not because of anything that the teachers or the school policy per se is doing. So I think, if in cloud cuckoo land, if we could fix that, then our outcomes would go through the roof, because this country has some brilliant teachers and they're not free to teach.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're not saying that you wish that behavior management was better at a system level. You just say, I wish that there was no need for behavior management.
My truest, deepest wish is that there were no need for behavior management.
Yeah.
Now, because I'm a pragmatist and I live in the world as it is and not as it should be, obviously I prefer it if, that video that I did on behavior management, it was 20 minutes, right? Why is it that people are going through an entire PGCE and they're not being taught those strategies? Right? And there are some that there are, but like, that video would not have tens of thousands of hits if people knew all this stuff. Right? It wouldn't have tens of thousands of hits if people weren't struggling with behavior. So yes, obviously, like, I do this stuff, I write these blogs, I do these videos because I want people to be able to feel more comfortable in the classroom and get better outcomes for their students and not go home with the debilitating anxiety that comes with the lesson ruined. I want that, sure. but I don't think we should want it. I think the fact that teaching standard 7 is about managing student behavior sets low expectations, right? Teaching standard 1 is about setting high expectations. Teaching standard 7, you've got to manage behavior. What that means is that you're expecting students to misbehave, right? How is that a high expectation? And yet you live in the world as it is, not as it should be. So there is, without a doubt, tension there. But if we could, to work and teach in a society where students just didn't misbehave would be a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Okay. So going back to the realist thing, and we move on to the solution part. What do you think in this messy reality in which we unfortunately live? What is the closest thing to a fix that you see at a system level for behaviour?
Oh, I don't think there is a fix at system level. I mean, I don't know. Like, I think. If you take the schools that do a really good job on behavior, right? So Bedford free, right? So without talking about, let's say we're going to completely ignore Michaela, we're going to completely ignore Mossbourne, right? Bedford free, right? Bedford free school, beautiful behavior. They don't have a binary behavior policy. Dixon's Trinity, I can't remember exactly what their policy is, but they've got lovely behavior. And there's no student there feeling like oppressed. I'm not saying that they are, or those other schools I mentioned, but there's no doubt that the students there don't feel oppressed or micromanaged or unfairly treated in any way. So I think what you have to do is think about how that is replicated and scaled up. At a policy level, it's kind of complicated. I think some people would say, some really dyed-in-the-wool traditionalists would say things like, it's not easy enough to exclude students, right? And I think probably for some kids it's not. I had to teach 2 kids who had been caught on site trying to sell drugs because they'd won an appeal, right? I mean, that's crazy, right? It's just, to me, that is completely mad. Or colleagues who work in schools where a kid's walked in with a knife one day and they've been back in school the next week. Like, it's just, it's just mad. Right. I think that's gone too far. Yeah, the permanent exclusion has to be the last resort. It's got to be the point at which you've tried everything else and it doesn't work, but it has to be a possibility. So I think some would say that that's got to be a part of it. But like, do I think that that's what's the rot of society that's causing this to be an acceptable thing? No, I don't. I think there's just like a cultural attitude that like this is just what happens in schools. Is that for me to like? That's not my problem. I'm not society. I'm a teacher. So yeah, I think as a policy level, we can scale stuff up from some of the schools that do things effectively, but you've got to find systems that would work in an average school. So like Michaela is clearly not an average school. It's run by a head teacher who is clearly not an average head teacher, and she's got a staff who are committed ideologues. Right? Most schools are not like that. So if you said to most schools, just copy what Michaela does, right, they wouldn't be able to do it. So you need to find something that would work in the average school. I don't know exactly what that is. I think it's difficult. And I hate to sound pessimistic about it, but I think at the moment, the only way to improve things is just slowly, trudgingly, individual teachers, getting it right in the classroom before it turns into an argument. And yeah, like even policies, like you can take a good policy, put it in an average school and it won't get put in place well. You could take a bad policy and put it in an above average school and it will be okay. I think the behavior policy at my school, for example, I think if that were replicated at my last school, behavior would be much worse in my last school than it is in my current school. Because, so I think our policy is a bit shaky, it's a bit flimsy, but because of the quality of our SLT, and, I guess the commitment of the staff, it kind of works. And it's still not perfect, but it's better. So it's like, it's crazy intractable. And then, yeah, unfortunately, you do have some people who do strongly just disagree with a lot of the stuff that I've said, who disagree with a lot of the measures that I've said. There are people who oppose all forms of consequences. There are people who oppose even light forms of consequences. There are people who don't have a problem with light ones, but have a problem with slightly heavier ones. There are people who think that the whole thing should be done by restorative justice. The whole thing should be governed by relationship. And like these people in this occasion, right, are not on the sidelines. right? Ban the booths was a fringe event at NEU, and nobody was like, this is not a good idea, right? Ban the booths, no more exclusions. The people who genuinely have a problem with sanctions and consequences and anything of the sort, and the kind of the ease with which people point to trauma or to adverse childhood experience or to SEND, and will fight every available, like every slight twist and turn. They'll say, it's your fault as a teacher. You did wrong. The student's not the one who's the problem. All of that is, that's still, I don't think it's as mainstream as it used to be, but it's still quite a noisy voice. And yeah, like it does make things difficult.
Yeah. It's certainly an incredibly emotive issue, right? Like temperatures run highest when it comes to behavior, more so than anything else, and I think even more so in the States than over here, from what I can tell. And I think that it's quite refreshing to hear you say that actually you don't have an easy answer to that question, that when you're talking about a system level, partly you were talking about like change management there. And I think that that's often the thing, that something that works in one context won't work in another context. And it's not because of the policy, it's because of the buy-in of the staff and the way in which it was implemented and sort of cultural norms. And it's messy, but I do think that there's a lot that we can do. My sort of latest obsession is implementation science.
Yeah.
And having something that's essentially a sort of tight but loose approach to implementation, so that you harness that sort of, these ideas that you were talking about in self-determination theory. Relationships is really a big part of it. And when you're talking about all of those things on the EEF toolkit, metacognition and peer tutoring and phonics and all these ideas, they're all sort of abstract ideas, and you can do them all well and you can do them all really badly. And what's really important is people, like implementation and running a school is a people problem. And if you look at it through that lens, then you can go quite a long way to harnessing the agency of people and securing their buy-in. And I think that with that in mind, you can make a purely self-restorative system work if everybody is absolutely committed to making that work, and you can make a very harshly punitive system work if everybody thinks that that's the way to go. And it's almost like it's not so much like that phrase, the banana armor effect. People are saying like it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it.
Yeah.
I think that obviously it is what you do, and it's the way that you do it, but it is the second part of that. It is the way that you do it that I think is increasingly, talking to people in the EEF, the people they're starting to realize as they look across all of the evaluations that they've done, a lot of it is about the how, at least if not more so than the what. So that's a biggie.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, I guess I'd be betraying my people if I didn't say to you that out of those two examples, the two polls that you gave, one exists and has worked in mainstream schools, and the other I'm unaware of. I regularly ask for examples of schools that do not have consequences in their behavior policy, of just like a standard mainstream state comprehensive with no consequences in their policy, and yet they have happy staff and good behavior. And I regularly get nothing. Every so often someone, points me towards this PRU or that alternative provision. I'm like, great, different context. I'm looking for just a state comp. I don't know, let's say 10 to 20% pupil premium, 10 to 20% EAL, that kind of thing, just like a normal school, and just with no consequences. And someone always points to, then brings up this particular state comp somewhere. And then I go online and they've either got rubbish progress 8, like drastic, terrible progress 8, or I look at their behavior policy online and it's full of consequences. So, I've seen one work, right? And again, I don't work at Michaela. I don't want to work at Michaela. I'm very happy at my school, but behavior is a struggle. It's really difficult. I've seen schools where you can have perfect behavior with consequences, with teachers giving detentions and sanctions and the like, perfect behavior, happy students, happy staff. I am yet to see the other side of things. And again, like, you have a different audience to the one that I'm normally involved with. If somebody tells me about a particular school, praised be. I would be more than happy to see it. But my eyebrow is most certainly raised.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not talking about examples of schools that have like zero consequences, but I know, for example, of schools that have gotten rid of detentions
Sure.
as a thing. And, you know, that you could argue that there's not a clear cut case for detentions, given that lots of the kids who get detentions are in detention week in, week out. Like,
Sure.
clearly it isn't working. And you could argue maybe it works as a deterrent, but I know that schools that have moved in that direction.
It works for the 90% of the kids who aren't in detention the whole time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, thank you for that. Let's come back then. You've done a very thorough job, I think, of presenting the case for traditionalism. I think in this conversation, it seems to be the big idea and the journey that you have been on, from previously sort of being like, what did you call it, a devout believer in discovery learning, to having this 180 turn and really recognizing that that traditionalism was the way to go for you, and many other people have been on that journey. So let's get back to this tweet. I don't know where this is going particularly, but
this is the beef.
let's round this up. So I wrote, and I quote, "Neo-traditionalism sells an attractively simple story," and this is focused. I feel like I'm overframing it now. I'm talking about. I'm talking about classroom practice rather than behaviour, right, and all the other things that we've been talking about. I was thinking about the actual pedagogy of traditionalist teaching, and essentially, I would phrase it as like direct instruction in a knowledge-rich curriculum, right? I think that those two are the two big pillars. Neo-traditionalism sells an attractively simple story. Knowledge is foundational, and learning is memory. Therefore, we only need to double down on teaching subject knowledge and helping kids remember stuff, and all will be well, if only it were true. Okay, so your initial response was, you said that's not true at all. Big straw man, and I think you're better than that. And then I asked you to sort of elaborate, and I was like, okay, prove me wrong. And you replied that I was confused. You said, you are confusing means and ends in a bid to unfairly caricature traditional teachers and teaching as somehow reductive and myopically focused on process of learning rather than outcomes. And you also said that I was ignoring that most traditional teachers believe that there are many more ingredients to successful education or equal society than children just learning things, as if the thousands of traditional teachers in high pupil premium schools don't know about wider contextual factors. And then you did /end. So you were quite pleased with that being the end of the discussion. So I just thought it would be useful to return to this. I mean, have you got anything else to add to that before I sort of offer a response?
Yeah, I think. I mean, the main point that I bristled at was because this is a common one on Twitter where people say, all these trads, they say they care that much, but like they don't realize, what it's like, life is like for these kids, or you don't see them criticizing the Tories or whatever. And I think that's, I think that's just so limp, and it's not worth considering. And then the means ends point, I'll try and illustrate with a story, if that's all right. And the story is of a lady called Mary, the super scientist. Do you know about Mary, the super scientist? So Mary, the super scientist, is she's a super scientist. She knows her field of science is light. So she knows absolutely everything there is to know about light. She knows about wavelengths, the electromagnetic spectrum. She knows about absorption, transmission, reflection, refraction, all of the above. She knows how to calculate the energy that's carried by light, the speed that it's traveling in, wave-particle duality. She knows absolutely everything there is to know about light. She's completely self-taught. The thing is, Mary, her entire life, has lived in one room. And in that room, everything in that room is just black and white. There are no colors whatsoever in that room. So she's learned everything she knows about light from textbooks that don't have color. She's never seen color. One day, a door to her room opens and she goes outside and she sees color for the first time. Now, this is a thought experiment from a philosopher called John Searle. And it's there to illustrate the difference between a computer and the human mind. As far as a computer is concerned, from the books, it's learn everything there is to know about light. There is nothing to know about light that Mary does not know, except what light feels like, except what it is like, what's called the qualia, what it is like to experience light. And that's a great thought experiment. It's lovely, isn't it? Right? The feeling of what it's like. That's what she's learned. And that's where he stops, because the point of why he's bringing it up is to illustrate the difference between the way that human mind experiences, and that experience is knowledge itself. And it counts as knowledge, even though a computer will never have it. He stops there, but I continue because Mary has a brother called Des. Right, this is where I extend the thought experiment. Des is similar to Mary in that he's been brought up in a black and white room. And he's got the same textbooks. He's got the same access to those textbooks that she does. But Des, he's not as bothered to learn about light, and he just spends the time throwing a ball against the wall. Bump, 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 the whole time. So while she's studying and learning everything there is to know about light, he's just chucking it, right? A door opens for him as well, and he goes out into the world. And he sees the same things that she sees. And he sees the color of the trees, the grass, the water, the sky, the clouds, everything around him. He sees exactly the same way she does. He learns, this is the key, he learns exactly the same thing that she does. What did she learn? She learned what it is like to feel light and to experience it. He learns what it is like to feel light and experience it. But answer me this, whose experience is richer?
So you're going to say Mary?
Always Mary. Because Mary's experience isn't just, oh, that's what green is. Mary's experience is, that's green. That's the absorption of red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, and violet from the sun. And the reason why those colors are being absorbed is because there's chlorophyll in the grass, and it's doing photosynthesis, and it's using the leftover energy within its, various Krebs cycle and all. I think I got that one right. Krebs cycle to produce, energy, to release energy and produce glucose, and all of that she's learning from looking at this blade of grass, and she's looking around and she's tying all of those experiences to all of the things that she knows. And the reason why the sky is blue and the clouds are white and the grass is green and the trees are brown, and all of that is like it's like a depth of experience that is completely cut off from Des. Des does not have this experience whatsoever. Sure, it might be a great experience, but it's not of the same level, it's not of the same quality that Mary's experience is. The difference between them, of course, is the stuff that they know, right? The point of if I was Mary's teacher, the point of me teaching Mary wouldn't just be, by the way, this is part of the point of teaching, but it wouldn't just be because I think it's important for people to know about light, but it's so that when she does go out into the world, her experience of that light is all the richer. And if I don't give her that, then she becomes someone like Des. And she goes out and she experiences light, she experiences all the same things that everybody else does, but she doesn't experience them with the same richness that she could. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's not just about memory and then all will be well. It's about the because. It's about the so what. And yet I'm not going to deny that part of education is people getting a job. I'm not going to deny that part of education is an inculcation to the traditions, norms, and cultural mores of society. I'm not going to deny that part of it is about transmitting the goods and the intellectual heritage and the cultural artifacts of society. But it's also just about making people's lives better and just like richer, and so that every experience that they have means more. And sure, that comes from their memory, but I'm not doing it just because I want to stuff things into their memory. Like some columnist in The Guardian says, I'm trying to stuff idle or inert or boring facts into their minds. I'm doing it for a reason. There's a purpose there. And I think that's the key thing that I think people don't get about traditionalist teachers.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, and that reminds me of, was it Richard Feynman, or I can't remember if it was Douglas Adams or somebody who said there was a similar idea that somebody was saying that a scientist can't see the beauty of a flower because their head is full of like equations about photosynthesis, and he was saying, well, actually I can see the flower and I can see the beauty in the light, but I can also see the fact that it's designed to attract insects, and I can see all of these layers of stuff that's going on, and it only adds to the wonder for me. It doesn't detract from it in some sense, and I can see the point that you're making. And
actually, by the way, to add to that, in the spectrum in the other direction, right? Your average punter looking at the leaf might feel its beauty. Sure, the flower might feel its beauty, but someone who is an artist would feel it also in a different way. right? So it's not just that the scientist sees it in a different way, but the person who's an artist and understands light and composition and all of that will also have a different experience.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to transmit to the students.
Yeah, I get it. So I mean, that's sort of an argument for knowledge, right? Like that if we furnish them with knowledge, that they will have this depth of understanding, that it's not just about passing a test. This is like this is the raw material with which we experience and perceive the world and so on, and I buy into that, and when I think about neo-traditional, like, so for example, I've spent the last 10 years of my life sort of designing and teaching this learning to learn curriculum, and then evaluating it and so on, and it had this tremendous impact, and it was not an anti-knowledge thing. Like, there's knowledge that goes into learning to learn. For example, if you mentioned oracy earlier. If we're having a conversation about what does good group work look like, or what's the language around debate, or the rhetorical techniques in some presentational talk, say, or project management skills, whatever it is that we're doing in learning to learn, there's knowledge that goes into that. And the kids who went through this program performed significantly better in their subject learning across the piece, which was the whole point of what we were doing, was that, like, how can we get them to become more effective learners in such a way that they actually achieve better in their subject learning across the piece. And they did. And so I don't think that direct instruction has a monopoly on subject knowledge. There are other ways that we can, talking about means and ends again, I think that there are other ways that we can serve that knowledge agenda. And that, there were examples of things that we did I'll give you an example in the learning to learn curriculum. In year 7, we did a project where we took the kids to the library, and we said, you've got to do a group research project, but you can only look at these shelves here. And we learned that the hard way, because the first time we did a project, we let them go on any shelves, and they just did ones about footballers and fast cars and what have you. So the second time we were like, you're only allowed to look at these shelves here, and it was shelves that was like basically stuff that they could do at university, but that weren't really on offer in the school curriculum. So it was things like astronomy, and there was politics stuff, and anthropology, and design and technology, photography, whatever it might be. And there was this one girl who found this book about feminism. It was like a really old dog-eared book about feminism from the 1970s, and she was like, immediately, like, the word just struck with her, and she was like, okay, I'm doing something about feminism. So they were in groups of 3, and they had to come back to the classroom, and they had to agree on a topic. So she wanted to do feminism, and the boy that was in her group, there was 3 in the group, but one of them was absent that day. He had found this big, like, coffee table book full of photographs about South America. He'd never heard of this whole continent before. He was looking at pictures of the Andes and the cultures and stuff that was going on, and he was like, right, I'm doing it about Latin America. I'm not going to not do that. And so we came back to the classroom, and we gave them time to sort of explore their books and to figure out what they wanted to do as a team. And then I remember just sort of overhearing them, and like neither of them wanted to give up their thing. And then the boy sort of suggested, he was like, well, why don't we do the history of feminism in Latin America? I was like, oh my God, that's unbelievable. And then the third kid came back in the next lesson, and he was like obsessed with China. He just was like doodling like Chinese calligraphy all the time. So they ended up doing a comparative like history of feminism in China and Latin America, and they ran with this. This was a 6-week project, right? So we sort of we let them loose, and that was a big part of what we were doing in learning to learn, was taking a step back. Because one of the things that I sort of have a concern about all of this sort of like being on the front foot, very sort of traditionalist direct instruction model, is that it's very sort of teacher led by its nature. And I think there's this incredible, there's a quote, let me see if I can find it. I put it out earlier. We used it in the book, by Monique Bocart, who says about how in traditional classrooms, there's not much room for self-regulated learning. Students are cognitively, emotionally, and socially dependent on their teachers, who formulate the learning goals, determine which types of interaction are allowed and aren't allowed, and generally coerce them to adjust to the learning environment that the teachers have created. And coerce is a strong word, and it's another sort of emotive word, but you can see her point. Like that's a question that I often have. Like when we lead so much from the front and in schools that are very top-down organizations, how can the kids learn how to self-regulate in such a micromanaged culture where we set a deadline, and if it looks like they're not going to hit that deadline, we swoop in and intervene, and we do all of this stuff to get them up to the point where they get the best possible set of results that they can get. And we think that that's like the best thing. I know in the conversation that we had earlier, we talked about how, John Tomsit has a line that he's used in his blog and also in his book, where he said that the best pastoral care that you can provide for a young person from a disadvantaged background is a fantastic set of examination results. And I can see why he thinks that. And obviously there's a big dollop of truth in it. But part of me just wonders, like, is that actually true? And like, is a set of exam results better than teaching them how to teach themselves, how to leave school with a disposition towards learning, so that they can be intellectually curious and confident enough to see that through. And I'm not sure that and this is not an anti-traditionalist thing. Like, I'm not anti-tradition. And one of the phrases that we use in our book is that we, when we're talking about things like project-based learning and oracy and philosophy for children and so on, lots of people, and group work, lots of people would look at that as very sort of progressive sounding stuff. But we would teach that stuff in really traditional ways. We would model what a good conversation looks like and what a bad conversation looks like. We would give them opportunities to practice it. It's like deliberate practice. We give them rich feedback, the opportunity to respond to that feedback, and you build it up over time, and you scaffold your support. And you can, so this idea that you can achieve progressive ends through traditional means, I think, is an important one. But I do think that at some point, I mean that at some point within secondary schools, we need to find a way to step back so that the young people can find out what they can and can't do under their own steam. Because as soon as they leave school, whether they've got 9 straight A's or anything downwards of that, or level 9s or whatever, that's not necessarily going to set them up for a life where there isn't going to be a teacher who's going to tell them what to do and when and how all the time. And and even for those, there was a phrase that Ian Cunningham used in the whatever it was, episode 4 of this podcast, where he was talking about the bankers who were responsible for the 2008 crash, and he described them as well schooled but poorly educated. This Sure. idea that we're not only talking about the sort of the third who are made to fail, and that's a whole separate conversation. But even the kids who succeed in this system that we have. I'm not entirely persuaded that direct instruction and a knowledge-rich curriculum, important though those things are, I'm not saying that we should not do that. I think that that's like the core, but I think that we should do that, and we should do more to address this other agenda, because I just don't feel like we're setting people up for a life of learning where learning never ends. And when we look at, if I could just finish with one more thing, I was looking at, the extent to which people read or don't read. We mentioned this briefly yesterday, but I looked at some stats. There's a recent survey that was revealed that an estimated 4 million adults in the UK never read a book. And that is, differentiates by socioeconomic background. So more than 1 in 4 adults from the poorest socioeconomic background say they never read, compared with just 13% of those from wealthier backgrounds. And I just wonder, to what, with the best intention, with that that phrase of John Tomsit's, like we're doing the best by these kids to get them the best possible results. And neo-traditionalism is like, it's an efficiency model. It's like, and all the stuff that you were talking about, behaviour and alleviating workload, I totally buy into everything that you're doing. But I think that we're sort of operating within a system that's all about getting kids to get the maximum possible amount of grades for every possible kid. And actually, I'm just not completely persuaded that's I think it's necessary but not sufficient. I think that there needs to be more to an education than that.
Yeah, it's good that you said necessary but not sufficient, because that's what I was going to open with. I think that Tomsit quote is key for me here, because I think to start with, we're talking about something which is very complex, right? And there are a lot of interlinking variables, clearly. So, for example, getting a student to a good grade in history not only is going to help them get a job, but it's also going to increase the chance of them being interested in history, right? And reading in history, right? I don't think you'd find anyone that doubts that when you're talking about probabilities, right? That learning being, we spoke about self-determination theory, right? So motivation is partly based on competence, right? So if I don't know, I guess like a good example here would be just any academic paper, right? I could give a chemistry academic paper to someone who'd studied literature, they wouldn't know where to start, and they wouldn't bother starting, right? So your knowledge opens things to you, and that's obviously not going to be the only thing, right? I teach students, I'm very proud of the fact that I teach students chemistry, and they get a very good grade in chemistry, even though they hate chemistry. I can't control that, right? I can help make it better. There will always, it's a fixed possibility, there will always be some students who just really, really don't enjoy it. If I can still get them to their grade, right, then I've done a great thing. But obviously, I've not guaranteed that they're then going to be interested as chemists for the rest of their life because they didn't enjoy it, right? So the relationship doesn't necessarily happen, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I can't guarantee all of these wonderful things by doing brilliant direct instruction, but I increase the chances of them happening, which is why, by the way, in Project Follow Through, on the affective measures, direct instruction was also the highest, right? So direct instruction not only beat the other 31 teaching techniques on their students' knowledge of English and maths and on their general cognitive abilities, but it also defeated all the other topics on their enjoyment of the course and of maths and English generally. Now, obviously, it's not a one-to-one relationship and it's not guaranteed, but you're increasing the chance. So when I can't speak for John Thompson, but when I talk about my need, my burning need at all else to get these students their grades, it's not because I think they'll turn into lifelong learners. It's because without those grades, doors will be closed to them. And yes, honestly, like I wish I could say to you that I think for many students it's both possible and plausible to just like turn them into lifelong learners. But like those 1 in 4 people, so would you say the 4 million people who don't read books? Like, why is that? Did they have direct instruction in English literature when they were in school? Probably not. They probably did group work. They probably did the speaking and listening GCSE exam, which doesn't exist anymore.
Well, there's something interesting there. I saw recently, there was a Sutton Trust report recently that looked at literacy and numeracy levels among different ages throughout the population. And the age group that performed best was 55 to 65.
Yeah,
people who were taught before there was a national curriculum, before there was National Literacy Hour and Numeracy Hour, and so this is something that I'm not entirely persuaded that all of this stuff that we're doing is actually going in the right direction. And if I can just pull it back for a second to that tweet, one of the things that I was talking about the neo-traditionalism selling an attractively simple story, that it's all about knowledge and memory and so on and direct instruction. I think that there is also a strain of sort of intolerance that I sometimes see on the behalf. I'm not saying that this comes from you. I've not seen it from you, but from people who would describe themselves as traditionalist. I think that there's often people who are very dismissive of certain things. And I'll give you an example, and this is from the book that you edited, well, I'm not laying any blame at your door here, but so I'm assuming that
the editor.
But Tom Bennett wrote the foreword. I'm assuming that you don't get to edit the foreword, do you? He's the series editor. Who knows? He wrote in that. Let me just find it quick. I've copied it.
It's available in all good bookshops, by the way.
Yeah, and the bit that I read, I've not got it. I will admit, but I read I read as far as I could get on Look Inside on Amazon. So in the introduction, Tom's talking about how previously people were concerned with teaching students how to work well in groups, be creative, and be tolerant, and so on. And he then goes on to say that these approaches are as far removed from the ideal as homeopathy is from open heart surgery, right? And that's that's an incredible thing to say. And not true, and I think that maybe, I don't know, I mean, so Tom has got a very sort of like strongly rhetorical style of writing, right? And he uses humor a lot, and I don't know whether, I mean, it's hard to know whether that's a joke or not, but I'm not sure that it is. I think that, given that what I've read of him, and talking about things like neuro-linguistic programming and all of that other stuff that he wrote about in, was it Teacher Proof, that book where he was, and he included learning to learn in the list of things that he thought were a waste of time. But to say that teaching kids how to work well in groups and how to be creative and be tolerant is to good teaching what homeopathy is to open heart surgery just seems to me to be just ridiculous and clearly not true. And I can see you're scanning the book there to see if I'm quoting him correctly. But my point is that it seems to me that it's clear that there needs to be a balance struck, and this is the conversation that we were just having. Shall I give you a moment to just check my quote?
No, it's not that I'm checking it. It's that
okay.
Look, I think, he is using colourful language. I think the pushback that he would give, I mean, maybe, I don't know, I'm not him, I can't speak for him.
Of course, Tom isn't here to defend his forward.
The pushback that I would give is that I think the standard trad attack line would be to go off on one about domain specific skills, and say that things like collaboration are domain specific. So your ability to collaborate in a particular area depends on your domain knowledge in that area. So I guess in the same way that I collaborate very well on building a science curriculum. If somebody said to me, okay, can you I'm a manager of a FTSE 100 company, could you just come in and give me some tips about how to run my board meeting? I'd be like, well, no, because I don't know anything about running a FTSE 100 company. So my ideas about leadership and collaboration are dependent on the things that I know and the context that I know. And I have, aside from there being quite a bit of empirical evidence to support that, I have very strong sympathy with it, because I know from just my personal life on reflection that whilst I'm very verbose and opinionated about, say, education, I'm much less so about things I don't really know much about. And I feel much more reluctant and anxious about getting into discussions about things that I don't know a lot about. And I think that existed before I was, a traditional teacher, that anxiety. And the same applies, we did at school, I'm the leader. I'm clearly the head of department. I'm the boss. I'm in charge, right? I did an escape room for a mate's stag. I didn't know what to do with myself. Honestly, I didn't know where to put myself in the group. I didn't know what tasks to take on. I didn't know who to take guidance from. I didn't know where to get feedback from. I didn't know. Yeah, it made me feel a bit anxious as someone who's normally very confident, very assured, knows exactly what he's doing. I was at 6s and 7s, so I do have some strong sympathy for that. So the thesis would be let's get Hegelian over here, right? So the thesis would be the 2000 to 2010 era, where group work is king. Where just by doing group work, they magically become better at working in groups. Just by having students talk in class, they get better at oracy. Just by having them take ownership of projects or decide what they want to do in some homework project on building a castle out of random tat you got from Hobbycraft or whatever, they become more creative, all of that. And I don't think I would strongly refute anyone to say things weren't like that, because they were like that. And in many places they still are like that. That's the thesis. The antithesis is that that's all nonsense. Direct instruction. Forget all of that crap. You can't teach these soft skills, right? You had Guy Claxton on last week, right? So or whenever, right? So Guy Claxton was all about those soft learning skills, the building learning power, right? To this day, to my knowledge, there's no quantitative evidence that suggests that building learning power is a good idea. Right. So the, that stuff happened. Right. And people did it, and people are still promoting it. I've still got the building learning power posters in one of my classrooms. Right. But like, you say to someone, yeah, one of these learning skills is resilience. You can just teach it to the students and talk about resilience and give them inspirational stories of people who are resilient and stuff like that. Okay. So the antithesis has to come. The thesis is that the antithesis is that no, resilience is, of course, domain specific, that I show tremendous resilience when I'm at work and I have a very strong upper lip and all of the above. But when it comes to other contexts, things that I don't know, like am I bullshit and negotiating with my team or with, SLT about things that I want my team to have? Yes, absolutely. Would I want to put myself up against a hardened used car salesman? Under no circumstances whatsoever. I would lose every single time. Right. But if they came into school, there's no way they'd be able to work their way around me and talk about some educational policy that I didn't like and get it past me. So the antithesis has to come. Now, of course, Hegel would argue there's got to be a synthesis at some point. And I think it's fair to say, I think you've demonstrated yourself that this stuff can be done responsibly. And I think I've acknowledged in this conversation that stuff like group work can be done responsibly. Things like discovery learning, project-based work, inquiry learning, they can be done responsibly at a certain point in time and in a certain context. I acknowledge that. What I do think and what I would be really careful to say, and I think this is similar to the point that I made about the schools, the behavior, right, is that I think there are far fewer examples of people doing the stuff that you've done and getting it right than there are of A, people getting it wrong, and there are of A, people getting direct instruction right. You go to, I think I said this to you in an early meeting. The stuff that they do, for example, at Michaela around oracy, around collaboration. My friend Pritesh, right? Pritesh Raichuri is the head of science at Michaela. He is he's an incredible science teacher. I've seen him teach firsthand and via videos. He is very, very talented, and he absolutely loves his students, and they love him back. And he does think, pair, share regularly in his class. It's a standard feature. It's not a bug. It's like a normal part of the lesson. Oracy is there, and then students who speak in a way that he doesn't think is good enough, he will pause them and he will say use formal register, or he will say project, and he will make them speak from their diaphragm, and he will make them speak in appropriate domain-specific language and in a quality that would be acceptable to the highest echelons of society, and in a way that would, to co-opt some E.D. Hirsch, it would not make them feel out of place at Eton or Harrow or Haberdashers or Westminster or anywhere. And I think that's a tremendously, tremendously powerful thing. So yes, I most certainly acknowledge that there is, that there is stuff there that is both possible and feasible. And I agree with you that a lot of the time that is done through direct instruction. Yeah, of course. Like if I put, so I did like a little quiz the last week of term. I've got a very difficult year 9 set. They're incredibly challenging, both behavior, academic, everything. Right. I took them on. Yeah, without being too hero about it, I took them on from somebody else because they're a nightmare. Right. And yeah, I did like a little quiz with them. I did a little quiz with them at the end to a bit of confidence build, that kind of thing. And I put them in pairs and I gave them a point for every correct answer. And a group got it wrong. And the girl had written the wrong answer. And the boy who she was with had said, and I heard him say, he said, are you dumb? It's not that. Right. And then I took all of the responses and I said, also, by the way, guys, I'm really sorry, but I'm actually going to deduct points from your team because I think it's completely unacceptable to turn around to your partner and call her dumb. I don't think you can say that to someone. I would never, ever do something like that to you. Can you imagine how hurt you'd feel if I said to you, when you got something wrong in my class, are you dumb? You'd feel unsafe. You'd feel anxious. You'd feel stupid. And you'd feel like this classroom wasn't for you. I would never do that to you. I don't expect you to do that to somebody else. And he took it on the chin, and we spoke about it afterwards, and he understood what I was saying. Now, obviously, I'm not going to turn around to you and say, no, you know what, social emotional skills like that, they can't be taught. They're domain specific, so there's no point doing that. Obviously, I'm not going to say that to you. I'm a teacher, and part of my job is to teach these students to become beautiful human beings and to kind of limit and exercise that part of themselves that falls short of that. But equally, I have to be realistic about what's possible and what's not possible. And sure, we could do that all day, every single day, and you wouldn't agree with that either. So there has to be a point in the middle where you say, right, well, we've got our like core content and like curriculum that we need to do. We've also got all this extra stuff. We need to have a very careful balance, both between what's possible on both sides and what's pragmatic. We don't have the kids the whole time. We don't keep them with us around the clock. And part of traditional teaching is about trying to do that as well. But it's about doing it, I guess, in a more like in a way that's kind of like that's more, it's not done as like a separate program. It's almost part and parcel. So when I'm talking to my students about effective study habits, when I'm calling someone at home and I'm telling them how they need to set up their desk in order to work, when I'm telling a student off because of the way they spoke to their mum, all of that is important to me, and it's a part of my job, right? And to be sure, there are some traditional teachers who don't think it should be part of their job. Okay, it is part of my job, and I would imagine that out of the 450,000 teachers in this country, 445,000 of them would say that it's a really important part of their job and it's one that they care about tremendously. I guess I would say the way we do it is maybe different. Yeah, I want my students to be excited outside of the classroom. I want them to know about feminism. I want them to know about Latin American feminism. Sure. Okay, so how am I going to do that? Is it going to be by taking them to a library and just saying, go find a book that's interesting? Or is it the way that I tailor my instruction and the stories that I tell about my story? I tell a lot of stories about my life to my students. I tell them a lot of things about my personal life that I don't necessarily tell to everybody else. My students know that I have two children. They know that my two children call me Abba, and they know that my two children call my wife Imma. They know the things that I have in my house. They know the things that I like to eat. They know the places that I've gone on holiday. Not because I think it's cool to talk to them about it outside, but they know that I went to Cornwall because I spoke to them about the time I went down a tin mine with my wife, and I spoke to them about how in this mine the tunnels were about 1.5 feet tall, and they used to send children down, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, and they would have nothing but a leather hat with a wax candle stuck to it, and these kids would go down before it got light in the morning, and they'd come up after it got dark in the evening, and they'd be on their hands and feet in the water in the dark all day mining tin. And I would talk to my students about how grateful they should be that they're not those students. And then I would say, and by the way, when I was in the tin mine, I saw this beautiful blue streak of rock on the wall, and that's tin oxide. That's what they were mining. That's what they were trying to hack out. You can't tell me that I'm not building the student's character by that. But I'm doing it in a way that I know, and in a way that is deeply personal to me, and is a part of my instruction.
Yeah, I get it. And that sounds a lot like synthesis to me. There was another thing that you said in response to that tweet. You described it as divisive, and I accept that it was divisive, and using even just using the phrase like the neo-traditionalism is X, Y, or Z. It's just an unhelpful label, I think. Although in its defense, it did get more response to my normal tweets, and it ended up with you coming on the podcast, right? So it worked.
All things end well.
All things end well, because I do want to blow open this conversation in a way. I'd like to do another one with you where we start at the point that we're at now, because I've got to go in a minute and to pick up my son. About what does this balanced curriculum look like in practice? Let's start with this synthesis. We accept that the skills heavy stuff under New Labour was bad. We can accept that actually dismissing group work as nonsense is actually really unhelpful, and that we need something that's really balanced here. And what does that actually look like? And that's a thing that just as a final point, it feels to me like lots of the stuff that I see people writing about and talking about and thinking about within the sort of traditional umbrella, if you like, is it seems to me that it's quite an individualistic account of what's going on, like cognitive load theory, and about furnishing things in memory and testing and so on. And it's there's a balance to be struck here, right? That's a better than thing, like helping kids to do better in their subjects and helping them to get really good exam grades is that's quite an individualistic pursuit. How can I be better than other people in the exam? That's literally what exams are. It's a zero-sum game, and it's useful to do that, right? We want some competition. We want some individual pursuit, individual sort of self-actualization. But there's also collective stuff, and it seems like that stuff that Tom Bennett was dismissing, the stuff about group work. What were the examples? group work, tolerance was the other one. These are things that typically people who are on the progressive side of the aisle tend to be more interested in. They're more interested in like social and emotional aspects of learning and things that are more like about recognizing. My friend Kate McAllister has a nice phrase. She's like, we should be teaching kids how to live in a world that's made of other people, you know. Sure. And it seems to me that we're not doing a massively good job of teaching people how to get along with each other. And my goodness, like 5 minutes on Twitter or staring at the news will confirm that to you. So I'm really keen to have more of a granular conversation about what that might look like in terms of a school curriculum, or and you know the examples that you're talking about using narrative and using stories in classes are really rich examples of what that can look like in practice. But I'd love to have that conversation some of the time. I think it will have to be, because you know, I think that we could both talk till the end of time, it feels like, but we're going to have to draw this to a close at some point. So now feels like as good a time as any, unless you've got anything else to add.
Well, no, just as a postscript to point out that, yeah, I think there is a synthesis there to be had. I think that line of synthesis is still going to be closer to my side than it was before. I think that's an important postscript, because it is important to me that, like, that I don't want people to come away from this thinking, oh, you know, Adam thinks no best way overall, or Adam thinks it's all about the way that you do things. I think there is a point at which I moderate and shift, but I'm not shifting here towards the middle. You know, like the group work is a great example. Like, I think it does work. I think my maths team gets it, and they get it right. I think there's probably a handful of maths departments in the entire country that could do what they do. Right? There's probably a couple of dozen departments generally in the country that could do what they do. So yes, I'm acknowledging that it works, but I'm not shifting a huge distance.
Right. To be continued.
To be continued.
Thank you so much for sharing your evening with me. I've really enjoyed it.
I did too.
Good stuff. All right.
And remember, divisive isn't always bad.
I know, right? That's the awful thing. We're all playing this game, aren't we? Like, the newspapers do it, and we're all like, oh, isn't it bad? If it bleeds, it leads. We're just spreading the misery. But, like, you write a lovely balanced tweet like I've been doing for the last 10 years. That's why I've not got any followers on Twitter.
Time is a measure of change.